Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 441 through 450 of the previous episode. At the foot of the lone peak in Stalactite Mountain, a momentous clash unfolds. Jian Lai, having honed his martial arts through a million punches and tempered his soul via the Sword Qi Great Wall, finally confronts the formidable Ding Ying. Despite Ding Ying's overwhelming mastery and the chaotic interference of his own past failures, Jian Lai stands his ground. Drawing upon the profound sword intent he witnessed from Mr. Qi, Jian executes a strike that mirrors the scholarly sage's own power, shattering the formation and forcing the arrogant Ding Ying onto the defensive. In this intense display of martial Dao, Jian transcends his previous limitations. With his foundation solidified and his spirit unbroken, Jian proves that even a simple martial artist can stand as an equal to the world's most powerful immortals, setting the stage for his eventual journey to the Sword Qi Great Wall. If you're able to, please support me on PayPal to help me stay active. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 451. One needed to throw punches after learning fist techniques, and one needed to unleash sword strikes after learning sword techniques. No matter what, one needed to stand up and make oneself heard. Ding Ying's mind instantly became clear, allowing him to feel completely calm and at ease. If he retreated from one sword strike, two sword strikes, and every single sword strike, then where in the world would he end up retreating to? How could he still challenge the heavens? He would treat this young otherworldly immortal, this young boy called Jian Lai, as the heavens. After beating this person to death, he would then charge ahead to beat that larger entity to death. At that time, clarity would return to heaven and earth, and the world would welcome a brand new beginning. Why don't I, Ding Ying, try my hand at becoming the new heaven? Ding Ying roared with delighted laughter, forming seals with his hands as his soul wandered out of his body. Indeed, his Yin soul was surprisingly wandering around the world during the daytime. The Yin god held a hand behind his back and extended another hand forward, shielding its eyes from the sun as its impassioned voice sounded in the mind's lake of Ding Ying. Will Ding Ying become more powerful if I vanish from the world? Ding Ying was naturally speaking to himself. A moment later, Jian Lai drifted to the ground with lasting qi in his hand and a slightly awkward expression on his face. As it turned out, Jian Lai's breath of true qi had already been at its limit, stretched to the last of its power to unleash the sword strike with much difficulty. However, the intent of the sword strike was far too grand, while Jian Lai's current power was far too measly. As a result, he had failed to unleash the proper might of the sword strike. In the end, his sword strike had appeared far more magnificent than it was damaging. Even Jian Lai, who didn't care about anything else when fighting, couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Meanwhile, the Yin god who had resolved to sacrifice itself only had its hand and arm sliced off. It looked over in puzzlement before silently retreating several steps and returning to Ding Ying's body. Ding Ying and Jian Lai tacitly paused their battle for a brief moment. Jian Lai had to replenish his breath of qi. Ding Ying needed to soothe his soul. It was also at this moment that their minds suddenly calmed down, like a ship dropping its anchor. The old Taoist priest only just arrived at the city wall after leaving the well. He smiled and made up his mind. None of the grandmasters on the city wall, not even otherworldly immortals like Zhou Fei who had their power completely intact, were able to detect the old Taoist priest's presence. Perhaps it was her sixth sense, but only Fan Wanner glanced toward that side of the city wall. However, she didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so she quickly retracted her gaze. Eugenie looked around and said in a begrudging voice, I was extremely careful with each step I took when cultivating immortal techniques, and I thought that I could at least challenge Ding Ying to a battle. Who would have imagined that I'm still far inferior to him? In the end, Ding Ying is fortune's favorite child in this world. Is there truly no opportunity for immortal cultivators to rise to the top? Zhou Fei clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, Old Demon Ding is trying to obtain all of the martial fortune for himself. Did he suddenly become enlightened to something and obtain the recognition of this heaven and earth's regulations? That can't be, right? After all of us here are still alive and well, so how can Ding Ying possibly obtain such immense fortune? He's not the lunatic emperor from Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's Lu Empire, Someone who decided to go all out and secretly give half of his empire's martial fortune to his son upon seeing that his empire was about to fall. Zhou Fei continued to ramble on about these things, secretly feeling amused. In any case, he was merely an onlooker who didn't care about how dire the battle became. How do you know about these minor matters from the measly eastern treasured vile continent in the north? Lu Feng asked. Zhou Fei smiled and replied, I'm the clan leader of the Jiang clan after all, so how can I ignore everything that's going on in Majestic World? Someone will often keep me informed in my dreams. Something is possible? Lu Feng asked in puzzlement. Just spend some money, Zhou Fei replied. However, Zhou Fei appeared a little pained as he huffed. The short night of spring is worth 1,000 taels of gold. However, that's nothing at all. My one dream a year is what's truly going to cost me mountains of gold and silver. Standing in the distance, Eugenie furrowed his brow as the silver-colored lotus flower hat in his hand shuddered violently. The lotus petals suddenly burst open, allowing a streak of dark green light to break free and vanish into the distance, rapidly soaring toward the south. When the right moment came, both heaven and earth would offer their strength. Wisps of ethereal and faintly discernible light rushed toward Ding Ying from all directions. Ding Ying closed his eyes and accepted the boundless martial fortune from heaven and earth. Meanwhile, Qian Pingan's Dao robe, golden sweet wine, suddenly billowed in the air. It no longer appeared as a snow-white robe, and it instead returned to its original appearance as a dazzling golden robe. Not only this, but first also soared out from the sword-nurturing gourd by Qian Pingan's waist. At the same time, 15th shot over from the distance. Qian Pingan held lasting qi as he stood on top of the small hill. Sword qi flowed down his arm, and 1st and 15th danced around him. After reuniting, the two flying swords, which had never been especially compatible with each other, appeared as excited and joyful as they had ever been. The sleeves of golden sweet wine flowed in the wind. Qian Pingan suddenly tightened his grip on lasting qi, causing his sleeves to loudly flutter instead. This was only a small hill. However, there was someone standing atop this towering mountain and shaking the dust from their robes. This was a battle between Qian Pingan and Ding Ying, one atop the mountain and one beneath the mountain. Each had taken a stride upward, and each had reached a brand new peak. This was the case for both their cultivation base and their mental state. Ding Ying opened his eyes and glanced at the wine gourd hanging by Qian Pingan's waist. He roared with laughter and promised, I'll drink the wine for you after our battle is over. Qian Pingan patted his sword-nurturing gourd, signifying to Ding Ying that he could try to obtain it if he were powerful enough to do so. The battle between them recommenced. This time, however, they didn't try to maintain a specific distance between each other. Rather, they would draw close at times and drift far apart at other times, causing sword qi and astral energy to flood through an area measuring 500 meters in radius. Ding Ying and Qian Pingan fought all the way to Bull Mountain, with dust and stones flying through the air as they battled from the foot of the mountain all the way to the peak of the mountain. Ding Ying was pushed from the mountain peak to the mountain foot by Qian Pingan's sword strike. However, Ding Ying immediately soared up and punched Qian Pingan back to the mountain peak. Ding Ying slowly climbed the mountain, with each casual punch like a punch coming from a deity measuring 300 meters in height as it smashed into Bull Mountain. Qian Pingan obliterated each punch with a single slash. After obtaining the martial fortune of heaven and earth, Ding Ying's Yin soul surprisingly drifted out from his body again, transforming into a golden Dao manifestation that towered above Bull Mountain. The Yin god clenched both hands into fists and pummeled Bull Mountain again and again. Qian Pingan should have switched to the rain evaporation technique to deal with Ding Ying's attacks, yet he no longer considered switching back to fist techniques after grabbing his immortal sword. Even though he was continually pushed down along with the peak of Bull Mountain by the golden Dao manifestation, he still insisted on using his sword to face his enemy. Dust and debris from Bull Mountain were already blotting out heaven and earth, with giant boulders continuing to roll down and avalanche-like landslides continuing to occur, carrying with them countless trees, vegetation, and rocks. This was the result of Ding Ying's overwhelming attacks. The towering peak of Bull Mountain was pushed further and further down. However, the young boy dressed in the golden robe remained standing atop the mountain peak. Ding Ying walked up to the lowered mountain peak, with dust swirling around him and dimming the surroundings. Seizing the opportunity when Qian Pingan blocked a downward palm strike from the golden Dao manifestation and obliterated its hand, causing shards of golden light to burst into the surroundings like a downpour of golden rain around the mountain. Ding Ying charged straight forward and slammed a fist into Qian Ping'an's forehead. A speck of golden light drew an arc through the air, starting from Bull Mountain and violently landing on the ground hundreds of meters away from Bull Mountain. The arc of golden light looked much like a golden arch bridge. Ding Ying unleashed a punch with his complete fist intent. A streak of white light shot through the air, appearing radiant and majestic as it surged forward. The destination of this streak of white light was none other than the location of that speck of golden light. Qian Ping'an was forced to retreat another 300 or so meters. Ding Ying was extremely frustrated by Qian Ping'an's tough physique. Even the peak of Bull Mountain had been crushed and reduced by dozens of meters, yet this young boy was still able to stand as if nothing had happened at all? Not only that, but he could still unleash sword strike after sword strike? Is this punch going to kill you or not? Ding Ying roared. The colossal golden Dao manifestation behind him leaped over Bull Mountain, leaning forward as its foot made contact with the ground. Meanwhile, its other foot was stomping down at Qian Ping'an's head. The golden Dao manifestation appeared indomitable compared to the young boy, who could only tighten his grip on lasting qi. The two of them continued to frenziedly attack each other, becoming increasingly content and delighted as they fought. Sword qi continued to explode around Qian Ping'an's arms, enduring the furious attacks that Ding Ying's Yin God was launching at golden sweet wine. The domineering spiritual energy was almost erupting right above Qian Ping'an's head. Qian Ping'an was completely engrossed in his battle with Ding Ying, so much so that he had no time to familiarize himself with the changing spiritual energy in the surroundings. Everything appeared extremely natural, and it was as if the existence of this spiritual energy aligned with the nature of heaven and earth. Even though he felt immense pain, as if a deity were pummeling him with spiritual energy, Qian Ping'an paid no heed to this and simply treated it like he would treat the torturous pain from practicing fist techniques. As for the chaotic spiritual energy seeping into his skin, flesh, tendons, bones, and then his acupoints, soul and mind's lake, Qian Ping'an didn't have any spare time or effort to care about it either. The mountains were tall and the waters were dangerous, and the path in front of him was filled with challenges and obstacles. Qian Ping'an focused his attention on the distance, as if he could navigate his way around some obstacles underfoot in a natural and intuitive manner. The path was still the same path, and he hadn't taken a shortcut or employed any tricks. Thus, those surmounted obstacles became a part of Qian Ping'an's life experience. The golden Dao manifestation's foot crashed down, blasting a huge crater into the ground. Ding Ying assumed an intuitive fist stance, with his true intent reaching a state where the thoughts in his mind could almost become reality. A palm faced the sky and rested horizontally in front of him, while one hand clenched into a fist and furiously struck the palm. Wind rose and clouds surged and the sky turned dark as a bolt of lightning as thick as a tree measuring a dozen meters in radius cracked down from the heavens. The Yin God had already retreated, crossing its arms before its chest as it looked on with a cold gaze. One after another, countless bolts of lightning smashed into that gigantic crater. The lightning was relentless, raining down with no reprieve toward the young boy who was standing hunchbacked at the bottom of the crater. They were like bursts of flood water rapidly surging down and washing over golden sweet wine. Ding Ying's eyes became golden yellow, and the sea of clouds that was like a lake of lightning in the sky unleashed the thickest bolt of snow-white lightning when he slammed his fist into his palm for the final time. However, this bolt of lightning didn't descend toward the gigantic crater, and it instead traveled slowly as it landed in the golden Dao manifestation's hand. It was as if his Yin soul were holding a sword. The golden Dao manifestation then sprinted forward, holding the sword in front of it as it did so. In the end, it grabbed the lightning sword with both hands as it stood on the edge of the gigantic crater, ruthlessly driving it down toward that young otherworldly immortal's head. Apart from the might of lightning, one had to understand that this sword also possessed Ding Ying's comprehension of the sword Dao. Ding Ying pursed his lips and clasped his hands behind his back, saying, "I know you've come. Are you only going to show yourself after Qian Ping'an dies? You're truly very generous, and this otherworldly immortal called Qian Ping'an is genuinely the most optimal whetstone. What, are you afraid that I'm too weak? Perhaps I'm not worthy enough for you to fight against?" Above the city wall, there was a cloudy expression on Yu Zhenyi's face. Zhongqiu chuckled and asked, "How is it? Do you still feel like you're an immortal who's achieved success in cultivation? Zhou Fei smacked his forehead and lamented in a sulky voice. Fucking hell, we're in the lotus flower-blessed land. We're not in majestic world where you can wield spiritual energy as you please. The two of you are far too. Forget about it. I'm definitely going to look for this Chan Ping'an when I return. I'm going to become acquainted with him regardless of his current cultivation. In fact, it's best if he becomes a guest elder of my Jiang clan. So what if his cultivation base is low right now? Lu Feng interrupted his good friend's muttering and said with a cold chuckle, the prerequisite is that he doesn't die. Zhou Fei sighed and removed the hand from his forehead, gazing toward Bull Mountain and sighing, that's very difficult. In addition to the rain of lightning violently slamming down, Ding Ying's Yin soul transforming into a golden Dao manifestation was ruthlessly driving a sword of lightning toward Chan Ping'an's head. Even though Chan Ping'an was wearing golden sweet wine, and 1st and 15th unleashed their full power to block this strike, he was still pummeled extremely deep into the ground to nobody's surprise. After Chan Ping'an vanished, the sword of lightning in the Yin soul's hands shattered as well. At the same time, sword intent and lightning chaotically erupted through the crater, with the scene in the gigantic crater reflecting the scene in the sky. Both contained a pool of crackling lightning. The battle was already settled. Ding Ying remained tense, ready to face his true opponent. An abnormally tall and sturdy old Taoist priest appeared on the peak of Bull Mountain not far from where Ding Ying was standing. There was calm indifference in his voice as he replied, "You're simply whetstones for each other." Ding Ying was just about to say something. However, the old Taoist priest chuckled coldly and said, "You're seeking death. However, this doesn't matter. Ding Ying, you have been quite interesting during the past 60 years. In Majestic World, pure martial artists tempered their soul at the 4th tier and tempered their physique at the 5th tier. After having his physical body smashed into the ground, Chan Ping'an indeed didn't stand up to battle again. However, a young sword immortal dressed in a flowing golden robe appeared inside the gigantic crater flooded with crackling lightning. He was filled with spirit, and he held 2 fingers together before lightly dragging them across the air. And thereupon, a sword materialized in front of him. This was identical to the scene atop the city wall. However, the difference was that another person appeared behind the otherworldly immortal in gold. He was a young boy wearing straw sandals and dressed in coarse clothes, and he looked a little younger than the otherworldly immortal. A sword hovered above the world, and the otherworldly immortal called Chan Ping'an smiled and said, "I have a single sword." As the Chan Ping'an wearing straw sandals rushed forward and grabbed the sword, leaping high into the air just like that time he had unleashed a sword strike at Middle-earth Divine Continent's Tassel Mountain. His voice was resounding as he continued, "Capable of moving mountains." After the sword strike, how could there still exist a so-called most powerful person in the world? Old Demon Ding was comprehensively wiped off the face of the world. The entire Bull Mountain vanished with him, razed to the ground by that single sword strike. Inside the gigantic crater, Chan Ping'an shook golden sweet wine. Golden sweet wine was no longer suppressed by lightning, borrowing its power to break free from the suppression of the earth. He pulled himself out from the ground, after which his 2 souls returned to his body. He then followed the incline of the gigantic crater to slowly return to the surface. There was a hint of laughter, perhaps mocking or perhaps teasing, in the old Taoist priest's voice as he remarked, "That sword strike was quite okay." Chan Ping'an grabbed the wine gourd from his waist and drank a hearty gulp of wine before asking, "Are you the Taoist priest from the East Sea that sword immortal Chan mentioned? Is this place the Observing Tao Temple?" The old Taoist priest appeared beside Chan Ping'an and shook his head, replying, "There's no such place as the Observing Tao Temple. Wherever I am is wherever the Taoist temple is." Chan Ping'an raised his arm and wiped the blood from his face. However, it wasn't long before blood quickly covered his face again. "Can I curse for a bit?" he asked. The old Taoist priest smiled faintly and replied, "Do as you see fit." Chan Ping'an's expression remained unchanged, and he continued to wipe the blood from his face as he said, "Old senior, your Tao power is truly as lofty as the heavens. How very impressive." The old Taoist priest nodded and remarked, "You're worthy to be taught." The old Taoist priest left just as suddenly as he had come. He left Chan Ping'an by the edge of the gigantic crater just like that, not telling him how to leave the lotus flower-blessed land nor telling him when this session of observing Tao would end. As for the fated opportunity of ascending from this world and the list of upper 10 elites, the old Taoist priest naturally didn't mention these things either. However, even though the old Taoist priest's sudden departure left a huge mess for Qian Ping'an to clean up, it gave him a huge sigh of relief. His heartstrings were about to snap, and as he finally relaxed, he stumbled several steps forward, swaying left and right, and finally collapsed backward in absolute exhaustion. Without a breath of true qi to stabilize his body, Qian Ping'an's wounds from the ruthless sword attack unleashed by Ding Ying's Yin soul completely erupted at this moment. Blood flowed unhindered, forming a puddle in which he lay unmoving. However, there was an extremely satisfied smile on his face. First and 15th were protecting him, and Ding Ying was dead. With no one else in the surroundings, Qian Ping'an brazenly wasted the last of his energy to grab the sword-nurturing gourd from his waist, shakily bringing it to his mouth and forcefully gulping down a mouthful of wine. He was already suffering agonizing pain, so this measly amount of pain was nothing but a tickle. Qian Ping'an felt like it would be a great shame not to drink at this moment. Qian Ping'an didn't notice that on the chest of his Dao robe, golden sweet wine, the originally snow-white pearl resting between the claws of the coiled golden dragon in the middle of the patterns was now filled with abundant lightning. The two slightly smaller pearls sitting under the claws and jaws of the two relatively small golden dragons on his shoulders were also filled with several wisps of flashing lightning. However, this slight change in the Dao robe was barely worth a mention compared to the drastic transformation of Qian Ping'an's body. When soaking in the pool of lightning just then, a hint of gold and jade-like luster had appeared on Qian Ping'an's bones. This was a state that cultivators referred to as golden branch and jade leaves. It was the sign of a solid and immovable foundation, the Tao to achieve longevity. Qian Ping'an was in a semi-conscious and hazy state, as if he was having a dream while half asleep and half awake. In his dream, someone pointed at a turbulent river and asked him if he wanted to cross. However, the person answered their own question, saying that Qian Ping'an would need a bridge if he wanted to cross the river and break free from the shackles of the great Tao. Once a bridge was in place, he could naturally cross the river as he pleased. Qian Ping'an didn't know how to respond, so he simply squatted down by the river and scratched his head. This was his true self. It couldn't be faked. The person said there was no story without coincidences. Qian Ping'an had already learned the reasonings and principles of a certain scholar. Had he not? After reading so much and understanding etiquette, perhaps those reasonings and principles were nothing more than empty words? Not hiding his emotions, Qian Ping'an grumbled. What does learning Confucian principles have to do with a bridge? The person didn't explain anything, and they simply told Qian Ping'an what he should do. Visualize the appearance of a bridge in your mind. Any bridge will do. You're still young, yet you've already traveled to quite a few places. Rest assured, everything will be fine as long as you visualize a good bridge. There's no requirement as to what the bridge is supposed to look like. In fact, it's okay even if you visualize those bridges from the capital of Southern Garden Nation. Don't restrain your thoughts when you visualize the bridge, and don't fear your mind becoming distracted or running wild. Feel free to relax your mind. The more relaxed the better. What you want is your thoughts to roam free, and be unrestrained by space and time. Qian Ping'an still had no idea where he was, but he followed the instructions and closed his eyes as he stood by the riverside. He involuntarily thought of that golden arch bridge in the sea of clouds. It was extremely long, so long that it seemingly didn't have an end. Qian Ping'an couldn't see that old Taoist priest. It was destined that he couldn't find that old Taoist priest no matter how he searched. Thus, Qian Ping'an naturally couldn't see the old Taoist priest's strange expression as he glanced up at the curling clouds above the river. He naturally couldn't hear the old Taoist priest cursing Qian Qingdu and complaining about the old sword immortal always giving him trouble. Nor could he hear the old Taoist priest bemoaning the old scholar for being a troublesome person to deal with. In the end, the old Taoist priest praised a junior's vision and courage, and he also reminisced about an old friend who couldn't be regarded as a human. What Qian Ping'an did see made his eyes widen in astonishment. From his feet to the opposite shore of the river, he could vaguely see the outline of a golden arch bridge. However, the bridge was flickering, clearly unstable. A book also appeared in his hand, and recorded inside it were the essays and teachings of a certain old scholar. This was the theory of sequential order that the Confucian sage had never expounded to the world before. Each character was dazzling gold as it flew out from the book and drifted toward the golden arch bridge that had materialized from Chan Ping'an's visualization. Each character was like a building block. However, it was a shame that close to half of the characters still remained lifeless and frozen. This was especially the case for the later chapters of the book. Not a single character budged from its spot. Regardless, the golden arch bridge spanning across the turbulent river finally became tangible, much like a person who had the support of vitality and energy. However, it was still slightly short of becoming complete and allowing Chan Ping'an to cross. It was missing blood and flesh. It was not much, but it mattered just enough. This was analogous to a person having a soul but no physical body. They would be nothing more than a lost ghost that couldn't face the sunlight and couldn't enter the Yang realm. Moreover, the length of the bridge, as well as the magnificent structure, were far beyond Chan Ping'an's imagination. It was also because of this that the characters in the book weren't enough. Give it a try, let's see if it collapses or not, the old Taoist priest instructed. Chan Ping'an shook his head and answered according to his instinct, "It will definitely collapse." The old Taoist priest didn't question Chan Ping'an's reply. After pondering for a moment, he left the small world that he had created. And then, there was no then. Chan Ping'an suddenly sat up beside the gigantic crater. Where was whatever long river? Where was whatever old Taoist priest? There was only the vast heaven and earth. The two flying swords, 1st and 15th, were also beside him. Even though they weren't Chan Ping'an's bonded flying swords, they had accompanied him on many long journeys and lived with him day and night, going through thick and thin together. Their minds were closely linked together. One remained silent and one wallowed in guilt. Chan Ping'an tied the sword-nurturing gourd to his waist and reached out with both hands, gently patting the two flying swords and consoling. "The three of us are still alive, so this is already a great outcome. In any case, we definitely won't be so stifled next time. Moreover, if it weren't for you two helping me block that strike, I definitely wouldn't have been able to endure until my souls left my body." Chan Ping'an stopped speaking because he discovered that 1st and 15th were becoming increasingly silent and guilt-ridden. He stood up and patted his sword-nurturing gourd, walking forward as he mumbled, "You guys should return here first. We need to hurry up and enter the city to look for the small lotus flower spirit. Our trip might not be smooth, and without you guys I genuinely wouldn't have the confidence to fight with anyone right now. To say nothing of old Demon Ding, if I don't rest and recuperate for a week or two, I might struggle even against that little child flying around on the sword. I might need the two of you to help me clear the path in a moment." The two flying swords returned to the sword-nurturing gourd. Chan Ping'an walked to the capital of Southern Garden Nation by himself. As he walked closer and closer to the city wall, the golden color of golden sweet wine gradually returned to snow white as well. Chan Ping'an came to a realization, and he turned around and glanced back. With Bull Mountain as the center point of the battlefield, the area in the distance was brimming with spiritual energy that lingered without dispersing. That place was very likely the biggest blessed land in the lotus flower blessed land. Of course, it also contained the most abundant martial fortune. If Chan Ping'an weren't in a hurry to return to the city to look for the small lotus flower spirit, he would have actually reaped the most benefits if he had stayed in his original spot and not moved. However, Chan Ping'an glanced up at the distant city wall and thought that he would very easily become the common enemy of the entire world if he hogged all of the benefits for himself. Would it be dangerous to enter the city under the watchful gazes of everyone? Chan Ping'an walked along the deserted official road, covering more than 30 meters with each step. Just then, he had spoken those words mainly for the sake of consoling the downcast 1st and 15th. In reality, if anyone dared to obstruct him at this moment and even went as far as to pester him incessantly, then reason and justice would only stand on his side even if he drew lasting chi. Witnessing the aura of invincibility of the barefoot old man in the bamboo building on Downtrodden Mountain was completely different from personally defeating someone who was invincible in the world. These were two entirely different states. Even Bull Mountain had been razed to the ground, so how could the heavenly drum be struck for a second time? How could there still exist a location for ascension? Standing near the city wall of the capital, even Zhou Fei, who was simply here to enjoy life, felt a little worried, with heavy emotions weighing on his mind. They couldn't have wasted 60 years for nothing, right? After the pool of lightning in the sky vanished, the clouds and mists parted to reveal the sun, allowing its radiance to shine upon the earth. Fan Wanner raised the copper mirror that glistened under the sun, looking at the reflection of her breathtaking beauty. Just as Fan Wanner was about to put the copper mirror away, she suddenly discovered that her reflection had a faint smile on its face. However, she clearly wasn't smiling at this moment. Her reflection sighed. Then, a voice sounded in Fan Wanner's mind saying, "Silly child." It was as if she were struck by lightning. She threw the copper mirror away as if it were searing hot. She then grabbed her head, which hurt so much that it felt like it was about to split open, with tears of pain streaming down her face. On a distant section of the city wall, Yura carefully called, "Palace Leader Zhou." Zhou Fei turned around, only to discover that the azure dress had automatically removed itself from Yura's body. It swayed back and forth like a dancing woman, only caring about itself and pitying itself as if there were no one else around. Zhou Fei chuckled coldly and said, "You still want to leave after I got you?" He reached over to grab the shoulder of the azure dress, causing the shape of a hand to appear there. The azure dress continued to sway left and right, continually pulling away and eventually ripping apart with the tearing sound of silk and cotton. Holding a piece of ripped brocade in his hand, Zhou Fei frowned and said, "Trying to toy around with me? Let me see just how long you can hide your soul for, old woman. Let me see just what you're trying to plot for." More and more pieces of ripped brocade appeared in Zhou Fei's hands. Both Zhou Fei and Lu Feng knew about Tong Qingqing's true identity in Majestic World. The Grand Elder of Peace and Tranquility Mountain didn't wish to see her take massive risks and gambles all the time, and they wished to temper her excessively rigid personality to make her less prone to breaking. Before throwing her into the Lotus Flower-blessed land, the Grand Elder had used genuine immortal powers to temporarily reverse her Tao heart, causing her to become a huge coward. They hoped that she could comprehend the Great Tao while traveling between these two extremes, eventually breaking through the barrier of life and death, and advancing to the upper 5 tiers. Since the otherworldly immortal Tong Qingqing was such a massive coward who had an irrational fear of death, it was only understandable that she would always keep herself hidden. However, to say that such a cowardly person didn't cherish their martial arts talent at all? This definitely didn't make sense. That being the case, what was Tong Qingqing's trump card? It was certainly something very interesting. The elders in Mirror Heart Pavilion, those with the same seniority and those who were even more senior than Tong Qingqing's esteemed master, all had extremely high hopes for Tong Qingqing. She had exceptional memory, and her knowledge was perhaps second to only Ding Ying. Her martial arts talent was even more extraordinary. If it weren't for her timid and mellow nature, it was extremely likely that Tong Qingqing would be the strongest superior grandmaster in the cultivation world after Ding Ying. Even though it looked to be a battle between good and evil on the surface, Yu Zhenyi's motivation to kill Zhong Qiu definitely decreased after the death of his secret ally, Ding Ying. Moreover, he had already obtained Ding Ying's silver-colored lotus flower hat, so it was without a doubt that he was firmly entrenched among the top 3 elites in the world. However, Yu Zhenyi wasn't willing to ascend, so he definitely wouldn't try to complicate the current situation and risk becoming the common enemy of everyone. After all, he had already broken a huge taboo in this world by allying with Ding Ying and plotting against all of the remaining grandmasters. At the very least, Imperial Preceptor Zhong Qiu, Knife Sharpener Lu Zong, and the cowardly hiding Tong Qingqing definitely had a very bad impression of Yu Zhenyi. Thus, Zhou Fei was actually unwilling to become enemies with Tong Qingqing at this specific moment. However, the azure dress in front of him as well as the golden arhat body that Monk Yenny had gone to the imperial palace to ask the emperor for were both fated opportunities that he definitely had to obtain. The former was for the sake of bringing Yura with him, which would allow him to temper his son's mental state. Meanwhile, the latter was for the sake of exchanging for an immortal treasure, one that he would give to Lu Feng. Springtide Palace's Zhou Fei would no longer be in this world for the next 60 years. Yet the alliance between the Sword Immortal from Bird's Eye View Peak and Springtide Palace would be more than enough to look after Zhou Shi as he climbed to the pinnacle of the martial Tao. In this way, there wouldn't be anything for Zhou Fei to worry about. At the end of the day, it was far too difficult for a supremely powerful cultivator like him to have children. This was especially evident from the fact that Jade Tablet Sect's Jiang clan had only had a single descendant for several generations. A bald old man carried a large luggage sack on his back as he ascended the city wall, with his movement as swift as the wind. He was none other than Monk Yunni, the old monk who had removed his Buddhist robes and left the Vajra temple. Fan Wanner was squatting on the ground and holding her head, and the old man couldn't help but steal a few glances in curiosity as he walked by. He was puzzled about why this celestial maiden from Mirror Heart Pavilion was suffering such agonizing pain. However, when he saw the preposterous scene of Zhou Fei tearing the azure dress to shreds with his bare hands, the old man who was no longer a monk flared up in rage and roared, "Zhou Fei! Baldy, did you really think this azure dress harbored some kind of good intention when it sought you out back then?" Zhou Fei sneered. "No, it was nothing more than a scheme devised by that old witch, Tong Qingqing. Are you going to stubbornly deny this and remain delusional, even after being deceived by her for half your life? This azure dress is indeed one of the 4 greatest immortal treasures and fated opportunities. However, is it truly empty as it appears on the surface? No, of course not. In reality, the soul of Mirror Heart Pavilion's Tong Qingqing has been hiding inside it for a long time." The old man was unfazed by this, and he continued to glare at Zhou Fei with his eyes wide like the statues of the guardian deities in the temple. "Did I ask for your opinion? What happened to the promise that you would bring Miss Qingqing out of this world? I've brought the golden Arhat body over for you, yet you dare to go back on your promise? Well, I'll dare to kill you then." Zhou Fei was extremely amused and he remarked, "Baldy, don't you feel embarrassed to refer to a dress as Miss Qingqing?" The old man was instantly rendered speechless, feeling slightly ashamed. Zhou Fei pointed at Fan Wanner in the distance and said with an expression of praise, "I'm afraid that Tong Qingqing's direct disciple, the future leader of Mirror Heart Pavilion, is actually the physical body of otherworldly immortal Tong Qingqing. Just like what Eugenie is doing now, she also reverted her age back then, returning to a youthful and childlike form. She then abandoned her cultivation and grew up in a natural manner, eventually becoming Fan Wanner, the young girl we see right now. With Reverence Pagoda helping her conceal the truth, you, me, and everyone else in the world, including even Ding Ying, were completely fooled by her." Zhou Fei roared with laughter and continued, "You even went as far as to fool yourself. I'm quite impressed, Tong Qingqing. So be it, so be it. These things are all external matters." Zhou Fei flicked his sleeve and allowed the azure dress to freely float away. Having released the azure dress, this signified that Zhou Fei could only fight with Monk Yunni if he wanted to snatch the golden Arhat body from the old man. After weighing up the pros and cons in his mind, however, Zhou Fei surprisingly decided to forfeit both fated opportunities. He simply held on to his status as the 3rd most powerful superior grandmaster. This status was still enough for him to bring Yura with him. To otherworldly immortals who were chi refiners in Majestic World, there were 2 common sentiments that they felt toward the Lotus Flower blessed land. Firstly, this blessed land was a very complicated labyrinth in a very small area. As a result, they felt like their hands and feet were completely tied no matter what they wanted to do. Secondly, one couldn't make bricks without straws. There were many times when they didn't know where to begin. Chen Ping'an's appearance had thrown everything into disarray, ruining all of their meticulous plans. Even Ding Ying could die, so who in the world dared to say that they definitely wouldn't die? Zhou Fei was worried that he would be subject to unexpected failure, and maybe even end up killed. Even though that wouldn't stop him from leaving the Lotus Flower blessed land, the price to pay at that time would truly be painful. Right now, the biggest problem was that only 2 of the upper 10 elites had been killed, the first-ranked Ding Ying and the last-ranked Feng Qingbai. There were still 8 of them remaining, so this signified that another 5 of them needed to die. Only then would the promise in the secret letter take effect. At this moment, Lu Feng displayed his intelligence as a longtime friend of Zhou Fei, the clan leader of the Jiang clan. He quickly understood the crux of the situation and promised, "Rest assured, with me watching over the situation, Zhou Shi will definitely rank inside the top 3 of the upper 10 elites in the following 60 years. Zhou Fei chose to step back and make a concession, in an extremely rare display. This being the case, Monk Yunni naturally wasn't willing to push him any further, nor did he really dare to. He followed Miss Ching to Fan Wanner's side.
Fan Wanner er forcefully med sås til at glabella.
The young and stunningly beautiful girl then straightened her back and patted her face, causing crisp cracking sounds to ring through the air. Fan Wanner extended 2 fingers and pinched the collar of the azure dress in front of her, shaking it a few times before putting it on. She then took it off again and casually tossed it to the baffled old monk, saying with a smile, "Don't worry, your so-called Miss Ching still exists. She'll soon recover her vitality if you go to Bull Mountain and stay there for a while. She's the true owner of this dress, after all, and my soul simply borrowed it as a residence for a few dozen years. Moreover, I sealed myself away after entering the dress, and this allowed me to enter a state close to death. That way I wouldn't be easily discovered by Ding Ying. As a result, I didn't hear a single word you said to this dress, whether that be Buddhist principles or romantic words." The old monk flushed slightly red as he hugged the azure dress to his chest. Fan Wanner squinted her eyes and fell into deep thought, no longer paying any attention to the old monk who had already fallen to mortal ways. Her memories recovered bit by bit, flowing into her mind like a limpid stream. However, she purposely pushed these memories to a corner in her mind's lake, deciding to ignore them for the moment. She started to review the entire situation purely from the perspective of Mirror Heart Hall's Fan Wanner. Senior Sister Zhou Shuzhen had taken her in as a disciple in place of their master, bringing her back to Mirror Heart Pavilion, a restricted area in the sect. There, Fan Wanner had simply bowed 3 times to the painting of her master. In fact, Fan Wanner had once been the person who wanted to see Tong Qingqing the most in the world. Because of this, Zhou Shuzhen had eventually given her the copper mirror. She had learned the white ape sword carrying technique, and there was a saying in the cultivation world that went, "There are 2 Fan Wanners in the world, one who carries a sword and one who doesn't." However, Fan Wanner had discovered that no one in this world appeared capable of unleashing the final sword strike of this profound technique. The required sword didn't exist, and the required martial artist physique didn't exist either. However, Zhou Shuzhen had still insisted on her mastering this white ape sword carrying technique. It was because of these reasons that Chan Ping'an had found things a little strange in White River Temple back then. Fan Wanner was clearly close to the Great Tao, so why did it appear as if she were being suppressed by a huge boulder weighing thousands of kilograms? Why did she appear so hesitant and sluggish? As it turned out, this was because half of her soul had been missing. As a result, she had appeared much like a mindless puppet, completely lacking in soul and spirit. Standing on a bridge one time, Fan Wanner had asked Prince Wei Yin whether he would often feel a sense of déjà vu and unexplained familiarity with other people and matters. Afterward, the old cook in the prince's residence, who had initially been ranked 3rd in the world, had also noticed Fan Wanner's strange state with a single glance. However, the old cook had mistakenly thought that she was the reincarnation of some otherworldly immortal. This would make one more susceptible to being possessed, and it would also cause one to have a unique aura lingering around their body. 1. Fan Wanner also recalled the 2 times that she had actively looked for Chan Ping'an in acts of curious coincidence.
Fan Wanner er kræk til grin.
Alright then, just how incredible was Chan Ping'an's background that her grand elder had allowed that person to possess her twice. Moreover, that person had risked grave dangers and twice descended to the lotus flower-blessed land simply to give Chan Ping'an a warning? However, it was a shame that the regulations in this world were far too powerful, making it incredibly difficult to take advantage of any loopholes. On both occasions, Fan Wanner had only been able to watch on helplessly, unable to speak as that person controlled her body. Meanwhile, Chan Ping'an had most likely viewed her as nothing more than a crazy woman, right? Fan Wanner raised a foot and stepped on the ruins of the city wall, leaning slightly forward and resting her elbow on her knee as she gazed into the distance, a wide smile on her face. Back then at the night market, a table of 2 people close to her and Chan Ping'an had appeared like a pair of mortals engaged in a heated argument. Both people had slammed the table and glared at each other, calling each other prostitutes and warning each other that the same offense couldn't be committed 3 times in a row. Otherwise, they would directly open a brothel in the other person's family home. The true purpose of their argument was naturally to deliver the message of not committing the same offense 3 times in a row. Even so, the curses and name-calling by those 2 people had truly been crude and vulgar. Indeed, it was extremely obvious that these words had been uttered by that stinky little Taoist priest. When she returned to Majestic World, she would definitely have a good conversation with this little Taoist priest who she had already had a bone to pick with for a very long time, even if the Grand Elder tried to stop her. Tong Qingqing's several chance encounters with Ding Ying during the past 90 years most likely had nothing to do with the little Taoist priest. However, she dared to say with absolute certainty that her capture by the leader of the Weapon Talisman faction had definitely been orchestrated by that little bastard in order to toy around with her. He was someone who held grudges for a long time. Although she had escaped unharmed, just thinking about it made her feel extremely disgusted. Moreover, the act of her being possessed had also led to wider implications. Most importantly, the Grand Elder of Peace and Tranquility Mountain had broken the rules of the Lotus Flower-blessed land. At the same time, all of the plans meticulously crafted by Mirror Heart Hall's Tong Qingqing had been flushed down the drain. The little Taoist priest had quickly finalized the list of upper 10 elites before Tong Qingqing could obtain the copper mirror and the azure dress. He had also claimed that the Grand Elder who had been miserly their entire life had come across an extremely wealthy person, which meant that they didn't need to worry about this small amount of money anymore. And as a result, the Grand Elder wanted to throw money at the challenging situation to directly extract her from the Lotus Flower-blessed land? Following the gaze of Fan Wanner, or Tong Qingqing to be more precise, one could see that the young boy dressed in white robes had already arrived near the city wall. No, to be even more precise, she was already Taoist nun Huangting from Peace and Tranquility Mountain. She was no longer the confused and easily manipulated puppet, Fan Wanner, nor was she the extremely cowardly and elusive Tong Qingqing. She called out to the young boy walking toward the city wall, raising her arm and giving him a big thumbs up. For the first time in her life, the renowned Taoist nun from Peace and Tranquility Mountain was showing admiration toward a male who was younger than her. Qian Pingan looked up, frowning as he saw this strange and unfamiliar version of Fan Wanner. He then looked at Zhong Qiu, and the two of them exchanged a knowing smile. In Qian Pingan's mind, the cultivation world could only be regarded as the cultivation world if there existed people like Song Yuxiao or Zhong Qiu. This was the case regardless of where it was. Huang Ting raised an eyebrow with the smile on her face growing wider as she said in amusement, "What a strong personality. I like it." Qian Pingan stopped in front of the city wall of the capital. Atop the city wall, there stood several individuals from the list of upper 10 elites. There was Yu Zhani, the leader of Lake Mountain faction, who had put on the silver-colored lotus flower hat previously owned by Ding Ying. A colored glaze flying sword was hovering beside him, and a jade bamboo folding fan was in his hand. There were tiny characters inscribed on each jade bamboo segment of the folding fan, a scripture pertaining to a profound martial arts technique. Zhong Qiu appeared relieved as he leaned on the destroyed city wall. His shoulders were hunched over, in stark contrast to the proper posture that the imperial preceptor of Southern Garden Nation usually assumed. Zhou Fei, the leader of Springtide Palace, was also there. Dragon General Tang Che from Northern Jin Nation had a solemn expression on his face as he rubbed the hilt of his saber refiner with his thumb. There was knife sharpener Lu Zong. Monk Yunny was holding the soft and silky azure dress in his arms. Chang Yuanshan was hiding in some unknown place in the capital. The wandering swordsman Feng Qingbai had died at the hands of his good friend, Tang Tie. The one ranked first among the upper 10 elites, Old Demon Ding, had also died at the hands of the young otherworldly immortal called Qian Pingan. Meanwhile, Lu Feng from Bird's Eye View Peak was prepared to stay in the Lotus Flower-blessed land for another 60 years. This was both to temper his Dao heart and to act as the pseudo-Dao guardian of Zhou Shi, his good friend's son. Apart from feeling slightly sad about the imminent farewell, Zhou Shi was also filled with beautiful dreams about what the following 60 years had in store for him. Yura from the demonic force was about to be brought out from this world by Zhou Fei. She was the person most affected by Ding Ying's death, with her heart as dead as ashes at this moment. Right now, everyone was looking at the young otherworldly immortal standing, still on the official road beyond the city wall. There was a cloudy look in Yu Zhani's eyes, and it was impossible to discern any expression from his face. Zhong Qiu smiled knowingly, thinking that it was only natural for Qian Pingan to appear so domineering and mighty after killing Old Demon Ding. It was as if the young boy were saying, "Do you see? I, Qian Pingan, was wounded in my battle with Ding Ying. Do any of you dare to take advantage of this and attack me while I'm weak?" If you dare, then come down from the city wall and we can fight to the death. Knife sharpener Lu Zong sighed again and again, feeling extremely worried as he rested his back against the wall. After witnessing that astounding battle on Bull Mountain, he genuinely didn't have the energy to become involved in this messy situation anymore. He felt like there was no point to any of this. If he still had the opportunity to walk down the city wall alive and peacefully return to his shop near the Imperial Examination Bridge, he surmised that it would be quite good for him to become an ordinary but wealthy person in the future. He would at most take 1 or 2 direct disciples whom he found likable. He wouldn't think about doing anything else. A hint of anger flashed across Dragon General Tang Tie's eyes. However, he only hesitated for a brief moment before deciding to simply close his eyes. Out of sight, out of mind. In the end, Qian Ping'an walked through the city gate just like that, gradually disappearing into the capital. Yu Jini hovered into the air and stepped onto his colored glaze flying sword, preparing to fly to Bull Mountain. The abundant spiritual energy that had gathered from all corners was already starting to disperse into the surroundings. As an immortal cultivator, how could Yu Jini possibly abandon this once-in-a-blue-moon opportunity? Spiritual energy was different from the ethereal and elusive martial fortune. It didn't discriminate against anyone, and one could obtain spiritual energy as long as they were capable. Tang Tie set his sights on the listless knife sharpener Lu Zong as he slowly walked along the carriageway. Lu Zong jolted in astonishment and he jumped up and scolded. "How dare you, Tang Tie? You think I'm a pushover?" Meanwhile, Huang Ting set her sights on Zhou Fei, someone she had disliked for a long time already. Mirror Heart Hall's Tong Qingqing could endure and tolerate the terrible acts committed by the palace leader of Springtide Palace in this blessed land. However, the Taoist nun from Peace and Tranquility Mountain could not. In Fan Wanner's eyes, the copper mirror was nothing more than an ordinary item. In Huang Ting's eyes, however, there was immense profoundness behind the copper mirror. She grabbed the copper mirror from the ground and forcefully struck it, shattering it. When it broke, a peculiar dark green aura radiated from the shards of the copper mirror, appearing much like a deep pool. Huang Ting extended 2 fingers and seemingly grabbed something before yanking back. What appeared in her hand was a sword in a scabbard. She was a supreme prodigy from Peace and Tranquility Mountain, the 3rd largest sect in Parasol Leaf Continent. She was going to become the next sect leader, and she was destined to reach the 12th tier as long as she could advance to the upper 5 tiers. In other words, it was only natural that she possessed some incredible treasures. Zhou Shi and Yer exchanged a glance because they felt a stinging radiance cutting at their back. The 2 of them suddenly turned their heads. They coincidentally locked gazes with the otherworldly immortal in white standing on the city wall. Zhou Fei chuckled and scolded. Old Demon Ding's ambitions were loftier than even the heavens, yet he failed to achieve any success and only managed to leave a trail of failures in his wake instead. He's truly screwed me over. He turned around to look at Lu Feng, who was also filled with helplessness as he lamented. Unless Qian Ping'an ascends from this world with you, Zhou Shi will definitely be in grave danger if Qian Ping'an chooses to stay in the Lotus Flower-blessed land. Zhou Fei pinched his chin and thought, if it was impossible to forge a good relationship with that young boy, then he needed to come up with a completely new plan. However, it was at this exact moment that everyone involuntarily looked up in unison. A huge golden hole appeared in the sea of clouds, after which a column of golden light rapidly descended and landed on the city wall in a flash. All it took was the blink of an eye. Apart from the otherworldly immortals and grandmasters on the city wall, it was most likely that no one else in the capital noticed this stunning sight. A short and young Taoist priest appeared in front of everyone, holding a small and exquisite 5-colored rattle drum in his hand. There was also a huge golden gourd on his back, so large that it was almost as tall as a human. The stark juxtaposition between the size of the 2 items made the young Taoist priest appear extremely strange and comical. "Oh!" Huang Ting chuckled coldly when she saw him. She turned her attention away from Zhou Fei as she strode toward the young Taoist priest, who was one of the most detestable people in Majestic World. The young Taoist priest rolled his eyes when he saw the thick killing intent radiating from Huang Ting, and he said, "I didn't come here to fight this time. If you take things too far and anger my master, are you really going to abandon your fated opportunities just like that and trash all of the sacrifices that your grand elder made for the sake of guarding you?" If this were Huang Ting from before she had experienced everything in the lotus flower-blessed land, she would have simply retorted, "That's something for my master to worry about." She would have then attacked as she pleased. Now, however, she cracked a grin as if she were telling the young Taoist priest to get ready for a beating when they returned to Majestic World. The young Taoist priest didn't back down, also cracking a grin in a carefree manner. This Taoist nun was actually trying to compare backers with him? Peace and Tranquility Mountain was still too small and weak, was it not? After all, it wasn't Mount Longhu from Middle-earth Divine Continent. The young Taoist priest cleared his throat before puffing his chest out and striding along the carriageway. His voice wasn't loud, yet everyone was able to hear him as he said, "The rules have changed, and I can say that this is divinely good news for you people. Those in the final list of upper 10 elites can ascend from this world as long as they remain alive. If you don't want to ascend and leave, however, then you can voluntarily leave the city wall after I beat the drum for the second time and before I beat it for the third time. Of course, you can still obtain an immortal treasure even if you leave the city wall and choose not to ascend. Remember, your physical body will remain in this world if you choose to ascend from the city wall. Only your soul will ascend and leave this world. Your memories will remain, but everything else will be lost and need to be started anew. This isn't all bad, and you can experience the profoundly mysterious nature of this by yourself in the future." The young Taoist priest appeared extremely arrogant as he swaggered forward, continuing, "Those ranked in the top 3 are even more fortunate. Second-ranked Yu Zhini can take 3 people with him if he chooses to ascend. Third-ranked Zhou Fei can take 1 person. My master has spoken. You can pick anyone apart from Ding Ying. Those who are picked can leave with their physical bodies." A lot of you seem very confused. There's no need to find this strange. You people are far too weak, so you never had the right to access this information and fight for the fated opportunity to begin with. If you try to get lucky, then Feng Qingbai's fate is a good example of what you can expect. After saying this, the young Taoist priest chuckled at Huang Ting and taunted, "Say, isn't this infuriating? You initially had the strength to rank among the top 3, yet, plans often go awry, don't they? There's nothing you could have done about this. After all, who told Peace and Tranquility Mountain to work with those 2 outsiders and break the rules first?" My master was incredibly angry.
Huang Ting pursed her lips.
The young Taoist priest cocked his head and gazed at Huang Ting's face, adding fuel to the fire as he said, "Huang Ting, why are you so shameless anyway? Your appearance in Majestic World wasn't half as beautiful as you are now." The young Taoist priest suddenly fell forward and face-planted, as if he had been smacked in the back of the head by someone. However, he wasn't embarrassed by this, and he stood up and patted his Taoist robes clean. He pulled a long face when he walked past Huang Ting, and he continued, "Finally, there's an old rule that's been passed down from generation to generation. Don't carelessly reveal today's matter to other people. Make sure to keep this in mind. Of course, it won't be the end of the world if you truly can't hold back and end up telling an extremely small number of people." After explaining everything in a short and succinct manner, the young Taoist priest raised the rattle drum and lightly spun up back and forth. There was no peculiar phenomenon of heaven and earth, and there was instead only a quiet thump. Was this considered the second drumbeat? Standing on his colored glaze flying sword, Yu Zhini bowed deeply to the young Taoist priest and said, "My respectful farewell, esteemed immortal." The young Taoist priest's attitude changed slightly as he faced this person outwardly the same age as him. He became slightly more serious, and he feigned an air of maturity as he replied, "Off you go. People all have their own aspirations. My master isn't necessarily disappointed in you, so please make sure to cherish the next 60 years. A rare hint of emotion and elation appeared on Yu Zhini's face, as he flew into the distance on his colored glaze flying sword. He was heading to the battlefield ruins near Bull Mountain to wantonly absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. He could potentially advance another tier after cultivating in seclusion for a while, and at that time he might possess the power to even rival Chen Ping'an. Zhongqiu smiled and asked, "What do you say, Lu Zong?" Knife sharpener Lu Zong pondered for a moment before chuckling. "Please help me sell the shop, Imperial Preceptor Zhong. With your incredible abilities, I'm sure that you're already aware of which youths I've taken a liking to, so just divide the silver between them after my shop is sold." Zhongqiu nodded and replied, "That's not difficult. This is goodbye then. Lu Zong sighed in response. Zhong Qiu cupped his fist in farewell. Lu Zong hurriedly cupped his fist to return the gesture of respect, and he couldn't help but ask, Imperial Preceptor Zhong, you're not going to leave with them? After you leave, you might still have the chance to return here in the future. If you choose not to leave this time, however, then you'll never have the opportunity to ascend in the future. Zhong Qiu shook his head and replied, Home is where the heart is. Lu Zong was still cupping his fist. There was a warm smile on Zhong Qiu's face as he gently pushed Lu Zong's hands down. He then turned around and left, walking down the city wall. The young Taoist priest shook his head as he glanced at Zhong Qiu's disappearing figure. Tang Tie quickly followed after Zhong Qiu. Monk Yunyi also left the city wall with a single stride, gracefully landing outside the capital. He hugged the azure dress in his arms as he swiftly sprinted toward Bull Mountain. Few people remained on the city wall. Zhou Shi looked at Lu Feng and said, Bring Zhou Shi with you and find somewhere to hide first. It's best that you leave Southern Garden Nation. The farther you go, the better. No one can stop Chan Ping'an after I leave the lotus flower-blessed land. Lu Feng and Zhou Shi didn't hesitate, and they immediately leaped down the city wall before detouring around Bull Mountain and heading toward the border of Southern Garden Nation. In the end, only 4 people remained. The young Taoist priest carrying a huge gourd on his back, Peace and Tranquility Mountains Huang Ting, the Jade Tablet Sects Zhou Fei, and the native-born Lu Zong. The young Taoist priest glanced at some stone arch bridge in the capital, the one under which armed sage Chang Yuanshan was hiding, and his eyes were filled with ridicule as he yawned and casually spun his rattle drum, striking a drum for the 3rd time. By choosing not to appear on this city wall, it could be said that Chang Yuanshan had wasted all of his previous sacrifices and efforts. He was unable to ascend, and he was also unable to obtain any additional fated opportunity. A brilliant column of light descended, shrouding Lu Zong within it and causing him to vanish in an instant. Not a single bit of him remained. The young Taoist priest clearly respected and admired Zhou Fei, so he offered an extra tidbit of secret information and said in a quiet voice, You don't need to worry about Chan Ping'an misbehaving and causing trouble here. He still has a long and hard road in front of him. An expression of realization spread across Zhou Fei's face, and he smiled faintly and said, Thanks. The 2nd column of light landed in the world, enveloping Zhou Fei. He managed to linger around for slightly longer than Lu Zong, with his body becoming fuzzy as he leisurely waved farewell to Huang Ting. The young Taoist priest smiled with squinted eyes as he looked at the frowning and silent Taoist nun from Peace and Tranquility Mountain. Are you very worried about your current plight? Huang Ting chuckled coldly and replied, Deliver this message to my grand elder when you return. They don't need to spend any money, and it will take me at most 10 years to achieve what Sui Yubian couldn't achieve. I'll advance to the next cultivation tier at that time, and I'll ascend with my physical body and return to Majestic World. The young Taoist priest was amused as he tapped his feet and started to ascend, with the huge golden gourd on his back. He wasn't enveloped in a column of light or whatever. He just swayed back and forth like a dog paddling in water as he slowly swam toward the peak of the heavens. Huang Ting only took a single glance at him before turning away, not willing to watch this scene for any longer. Only a little brat like him would perform such childish actions. Inside the capital of Southern Garden Nation, a skinny little girl sold the stack of books in her arms and bought 2 outfits for herself. Using the remaining money, she then ordered a large table of food that had only ever appeared in her sweet dreams before. She wolfed the delicious food down, seemingly afraid that she would lose out if she didn't eat quickly enough. Sitting at the table, she needed to raise her bottom high off the chair in order to reach the delicacies on the other side. The sides of her mouth were covered in grease, and she felt like she had never experienced such happiness before. Meanwhile, a little boy called Chao Qinglang was led to some government office by a group of soldiers. There were 4 straw mats lying outside the great hall, all of them covered in a piece of white cloth. The little boy dazedly squatted in front of them, not speaking a single word. Under some stone arch bridge, armed sage Chang Yuanshan was still waiting patiently for the deafening boom of the drum being struck for a 2nd time. Elsewhere, an impoverished scholar heard that someone had died not far from where he was. A good friend of his forcefully dragged him over to take a look, Yet the scene had already been completely clogged by a large group of curious people. The scholar only heard that it was a beautiful woman. He thought to himself that he would definitely tell his lover about this tragic accident when she returned. Most importantly, he would warn her to go out less frequently. It didn't matter that they were struggling with money. There was no need for her to visit her relatives to borrow money and buy books for him. Qian Ping'an swiftly ran back to that large street in the capital, with his footsteps becoming heavy as he turned into the small alley. When entering the capital, several grandmasters had been standing on the city wall and watching him. However, Qian Ping'an had still stridden forward with an aura of invincibility that he had never possessed before. Dressed in white with a wine gourd by his waist and a sword in his hand, he had strode into the capital in a confident and carefree manner. Standing in front of an ordinary courtyard with some of the cheapest couplets stuck to the walls, however, Qian Ping'an couldn't help but hesitate at this moment. He raised his hand several times, yet he put them down several times as well. He ultimately didn't knock on the courtyard door. Qian Ping'an had no idea the old Taoist priest was standing right behind him, watching his each and every movement. The old Taoist priest wanted to know two things. How did Qian Ping'an view himself? How did Qian Ping'an view the world? Qian Ping'an pushed the door open and entered. No one was inside the courtyard. The old lady who rambled and complained all the time was gone, so Qian Ping'an naturally couldn't hear her cursing the heavens and swearing at the earth anymore. She was a sharp-tongued but soft-hearted person. The simple and honest-looking woman who would actually steal books from other people was gone, so Qian Ping'an could no longer see her prideful gaze as she looked at her son. The old man who was terrible at Go, and the man who would always carry a bag around and try his luck were gone too. He would leave extremely early each morning, and he would always tiptoe around, most likely afraid to disturb his son who still needed to attend the private school to study. Qian Ping'an stood in the courtyard for a while before returning to his room. He slid Lasting Qi back inside its scabbard on the table, and saw that the stack of books sitting there had already disappeared. Without a trace, Qian Ping'an squatted down and placed his palm on the floor, closing his eyes and trying to find some clues or traces. 15th flew out of the sword nurturing gourd with a whoosh, sticking extremely close to the floor as it rapidly flew around in circles. In the end, it stopped in midair with its sword tip pointing at the floor. Qian Ping'an immediately started to dig with his bare hands. With his current cultivation base, it could be said that his fingers were already strong enough to dig through iron as if it were dirt. He had advanced to the 5th tier when fighting with Zhongqiu on the street. Afterward, he had tempered his martial Dao while battling against Ding Ying. Tempering his martial Dao using these two whetstones was far superior to doing so with the old golden core tier sword Cultivator in Osmanthus Island, both in a physical sense and a mental sense. Thus, even Cui Chan's grandfather, the old man in the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain, would definitely view this battle with praise in his eyes. He would say that even pure martial artists at the 8th or 9th tier might not be able to generate such intense and profound auras during their battles. After digging for a while, Qian Ping'an found himself on the bottom of a pit deep enough to hide a full-grown adult. He used both hands to gently pick up the small lotus flower spirit on the brink of death before leaping out of the pit. He carefully placed the small lotus flower spirit on the table and took off golden sweet wine, scrunching it up into a ball that looked much like a bird's nest. He then placed the lotus flower spirit inside this nest. Afterward, he hurriedly retrieved a grain rain coin from his pocket treasure. Compared to light snow coins that only had a small amount of spiritual energy, lesser heat coins had spiritual energy that flowed like water, so abundant that one could vaguely feel it through their fingers. Grain rain coins had the most spiritual energy, so concentrated that it was like frozen liquid. Qian Ping'an held the immortal coin in his hand and suddenly tightened his grip, causing the grain rain coin to disintegrate into dust in his palm. He then unclenched his fist, scattering the remains of the grain rain coin over the small lotus flower spirit. As for how many strange and peculiar spirits this grain rain coin could buy from immortal shops, and how rare these spirits were, even for officials and wealthy nobles, Qian Ping'an was well aware of these things. After all, he was no longer an amateur who had just entered the cultivation world, and no longer an impoverished little boy in Clay Vase Alley working as an apprentice in the kilns. Qian Ping'an was learning more and more about the world. Jewel Small World, the Greatly Empire, Eastern Treasured Vial Continent, the Sword Chi Great Wall, Parasol Leaf Continent, and the Lotus Flower Blessed Land. Chen Ping'an carefully observed the small lotus flower spirit, and saw that the coin's spiritual energy was like spring water slowly seeping into a dried-up and cracked field. He felt slightly more at ease upon seeing this. The fact that the small lotus flower spirit could still absorb spiritual energy was proof that the situation could still be rectified. Chen Ping'an used his thumb to gently stroke the small spirit's clean and pure forehead. After placing the small lotus flower spirit in his Dao robe and feeding it some spiritual energy, Chen Ping'an filled the pit in the floor back in before leaving his room and sitting down on a small stool under the eaves. He grabbed his wine gourd and swirled it around, yet he didn't drink a single drop of it. After removing his Dao robe, golden sweet wine, an acute bloody smell exuded from his entire body. His life and death battle with Ding Ying had left him with severe wounds. However, it was also because of this that a tidal wave of spiritual energy had funneled into him, giving him an opportunity to flood his main acupoints with spiritual energy. Right now, the spiritual energy was tunneling through his many acupoints, with each wisp appearing like a force that was grabbing a piece of land for itself. Because the spiritual energy didn't take the same path as his breath of true qi from before, the pieces of land that they occupied could also be viewed as vassal towns that fell outside of the main cities. They were relatively isolated, and didn't link together to form a connected path. Thus, they were unable to become more powerful. Chen Ping'an didn't know if this was good or bad. However, he didn't have the time to deal with this problem right now. His most important priority was figuring out how to rebuild his bridge of immortality, and leave this blessed land. This observing Dao temple surprisingly wasn't an actual temple. Instead, wherever the old Taoist priest went in the world was where the temple would be. After learning of this, Chen Ping'an didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Why hadn't the old great sword immortal living in the thatched cottage on the Sword Chi Great Wall warned him about this earlier? Thinking back, however, he had scuttled around like a headless chicken when he had first entered the capital of Southern Garden Nation, yet after a period of unrest and frustration, he had decided to calm his mind and casually wander around. That had resulted in a very unique experience where he had witnessed all kinds of people and their nature. Chen Ping'an had appeared idle and lazy during that time, yet it had reminded him of his past experience as an apprentice in the Dragon Kills. The money he earned wasn't enough for him to spend profligately, but it was enough for him to support himself. At the very least, he wouldn't starve to death. Thus, after guaranteeing food and shelter, Chen Ping'an had always been in the same frame of mind whenever he went to collect soil samples from the mountains with Old Man Yao. Even though they camped in the wilderness and trekked through difficult mountain terrain, and he would be physically exhausted every single day, his mind wouldn't be tired at all. He could lie down and sleep in peace whenever night fell. Ever since leaving Dragon Spring Prefecture for the first time, however, from accompanying Li Baoping and the other children to the academy in Great Sui Nation to mysteriously wandering into this blessed land, just how many relaxed and peaceful nights of sleep had Chen Ping'an been afforded? Chen Ping'an woke up every so often to check on the small lotus flower spirit's condition. Even though progress was slow, it was at least heading in the right direction, and the small spirit was healing little by little. Seeing this finally relieved Chen Ping'an of his worries. Could wine truly wash away the worries and anxieties caused by the deaths and farewells of those close to him? No, there would always be times when one was awake and sober. Chen Ping'an no longer needed to worry about anything inside his room. But what about outside his room? Sitting on the small stool, with his arms resting on his knees, Chen Ping'an patiently waited for Chao Qinglang to return home. From today onward, this residence in a nameless small alley would be no different from that residence in Clay Vase Alley back then. Chen Ping'an stood up. It was dusk, and a little boy walked through the small alley by himself. The gate to his courtyard was open, and his expression was numb when he saw Chen Ping'an. Chao Qinglang lowered his head, silent and seemingly apathetic as he walked inside his room. Chen Ping'an wanted to speak, yet he couldn't help but hesitate. In the end, he remained silent and sat back down on the small stool, staying there all the way until deep into the night. They were in the 12th solar term great heat, so it didn't feel cool and refreshing even when the gentle night breeze brushed past his body. Chen Ping'an went to check on the little lotus spirit, and he coincidentally saw a crude-looking straw fan out of the corner of his eye. He picked it up and returned outside. In the second half of the night, he heard the night guard striking their gong from very far away.
Cao Kinh Lăng
Walked out of his room, bringing a small stool with him and sitting beside Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an offered the little boy the crude straw fan, and Chao Qinglang hesitated for a moment before eventually deciding to accept it. After a brief period of silence, Chan Ping'an said in a soft voice, "I'm sorry." The little boy remained silent the entire time. He didn't blame Chan Ping'an. Instead, he simply lowered his head and sobbed. The next day, Chao Qinglang woke up much later than usual, and there was no sound of him loudly reciting books either. Seeing this, Chan Ping'an went to the private school, hoping to inform Chao Qinglang's teacher of his absence. However, he noticed that there were few people on the street, and when he arrived at the private school, he discovered that the school was shut as well. He wasn't even able to find the teacher. Chan Ping'an didn't notice any spies from Southern Garden Nation in the surroundings. This was most likely Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu's doing. During the next 2 days, many families continued to secretly move away from this area. Because of this, the brothels and taverns near Champion Scholar Alley also lost a large majority of their customers overnight, becoming almost deserted. During dusk on this day, Chan Ping'an brought a small stool with him and sat down at the corner of the alley with no name. If this were in the past, there would be a table here and 2 terrible Go players would engage in an intense match with each other. Standing around them, countless other terrible Go players would offer their amazingly crappy advice. The street was still riddled with crisscrossing ditches and crumbled walls, appearing as broken and unsightly as could be. Suddenly, Chan Ping'an stood up. Zhongqiu had come to visit. He and Chan Ping'an strolled through the wide street, and evident exhaustion was visible on Zhongqiu's face as he smiled faintly and explained, "This region of the capital has secretly been placed under martial law, and speculations and rumors from all sources have been put under control as well. The Emperor and the Crown Prince are both extremely interested in you, and they both want to meet you. However, I persuaded them not to invite you into the Imperial Palace. Even so, you can enter the palace whenever you want if you feel the desire to do so. Of course, you can also visit my place if you want to clear your mind and relax." Chan Ping'an nodded in response. Dressed in an azure robe with slightly graying sideburns, Zhongqiu surprisingly appeared much older even though only a mere few days had passed. It was as if he had experienced many vicissitudes of life. The Imperial Preceptor clearly had many things weighing on his mind as he continued. Eugenie has constructed a small thatched cottage for himself on the ruins of Bull Mountain, and it's clear that he's going to cultivate earnestly there. The Emperor has stated that unless Eugenie relocates his Lake Mountain faction to Southern Garden Nation, he'll deploy troops to forcibly remove Eugenie. However, Eugenie completely ignored the Emperor's request. I hoped that the Emperor could wait for a little longer, but the Emperor disagreed with me and has already started to marshal the troops. It won't be long before 10,000 elite troops march over and encircle the ruins of Bull Mountain. Chan Ping'an pondered for a moment before asking, "Then what about Mirror Heart Hall's Fan Wanner?" Zhongqiu roughly recounted Fan Wanner's life story to Chan Ping'an before saying in helplessness, "I speculate that the Emperor most likely saw her in private, and it's because of this that he's gained the resolve to make this decision. With her support and with Dragon General Tang Che staying in the capital, and of course there's me as well, the Emperor is likely convinced that the situation won't become too dire." Zhongqiu stopped beside a deep ditch. This was the location where Chan Ping'an had examined the dragon using the mountain peak fist stance and traveled on the wind, striking Zhongqiu and sending him flying. Zhongqiu smiled and continued, "The Emperor probed around several times trying to ask me about your personality and background. I couldn't lie to the Emperor, but I couldn't drag you into our mortal conflicts either. Because of this, I simply told the Emperor that you would neither support Southern Garden Nation nor help Eugenie. Carefree cranes will only soar through the lofty clouds, not involving themselves in the lowly matters of dogs and chickens in the mortal world. They certainly won't fight for food with these creatures either." Chan Ping'an cupped his fists in gratitude. Zhongqiu waved his hand and said, "I would be a lot more annoyed if I were you." Chan Ping'an grabbed his wine gourd and drank a mouthful of wine. Zhongqiu suddenly remembered something and he said, "I personally dealt with that tragic case relating to the family you were staying with. Many remnants of the demonic force were captured by the imperial court, And I can confirm that Ding Ying was the one who ordered his subordinates to commit this crime. His aim was most likely to pit you against Springtide Palace's Zhou Shi from very early on. After you two fought each other, he could then take advantage of the situation and draw Lu Feng and Zhou Fei out as well. Moreover, through Chao Qinglong's statements to the officials, we can conclude that Ding Ying's actions weren't for the sake of targeting you. Rather, Ding Ying mistakenly thought that Chao Qinglang was related to Mirror Heart Hall's Tong Qingqing. Chen Ping'an nodded in understanding. He then suddenly asked, "Where am I actually?" Zhong Qiu faltered upon hearing this, a look of puzzlement on his face. Chen Ping'an pointed at lasting qi on his back and explained, "I carried this sword with me and somehow entered this world by accident. I wandered around and searched for a long time, and I was oblivious to the fact that I had entered this world." Zhong Qiu smiled and told Chen Ping'an some stories about the lotus flower-blessed land and the otherworldly immortals who had come here. Only then did Chen Ping'an gain a deeper understanding of this world. Back then, the old Taoist priest had only revealed half of the truth. The observing Tao temple genuinely didn't exist, but it could be argued that the entire lotus flower-blessed land was in fact the old Taoist priest's place for observing the Tao. The first time Chen Ping'an noticed something amiss was when he had discovered the existence of two northern Jian nations in a single continent. One had to realize that he had found the little lotus spirit in a temple in northern Jian nation. In the beginning, Chen Ping'an had thought that perhaps the culture in Parasol Leaf continent was different from Eastern Treasured Vial continent. Because of this, he had especially visited the bookstore in Champion Scholar Alley to go through many unofficial history books and literary works. However, things had only become stranger and stranger. Even so, Chen Ping'an had refused to give up, visiting another scripture library that clearly looked like the private collection of some wealthy and influential clan. He wanted to understand the official history of the nation to determine Northern Jian Nation's exact location in Parasol Leaf continent. However, things had still remained as foggy and confusing as always, with the books only ever mentioning the history of the four nations. Afterward, when the dirty secrets of White River Temple were exposed, Chen Ping'an had felt even greater disbelief at the four superior grandmasters' choice of words when they gathered at Bull Mountain. They had been surprisingly fond of using the term the world when discussing things. For example, Zhong Qiu was called the most powerful martial artist in the world, Southern Garden Nation was the most powerful nation in the world, Mirror Heart Hall's Tong Qingqing was the most beautiful person in the world, and so on and so forth. There were too many examples to choose from. On that night sometime later, Ding Ying, Zhou Shi, and Yura had snuck into the Great Hall of White River Temple to look for that golden arhat body together. Before this, Chen Ping'an hadn't thought too much about this region, and had simply regarded it as an isolated place with no Tao. This was especially the case due to his interactions with the old monk, a qi refiner from Heart Manifestation Temple. Moreover, he had soon come across that azure dress that liked to dance under the moonlight. Thus, Chen Ping'an had simply treated this region as a place similar to Sword Saint Song Yushao's hometown, Eastern Treasured Vial Continent's watercombing nation. That was also a place where martial arts was dominant. Now that he thought about everything carefully, however, Chen Ping'an couldn't help but feel a cold chill and a lingering sense of fear. This was the same feeling as when he had glanced at that well back then. Even though he knew that he was in the lotus flower-blessed land, Chen Ping'an had absolutely no idea when or how he had entered this place. And he was unlikely to ever receive an answer to this question as long as the old Taoist priest didn't appear in front of him. The world had descended into a murky and strange state after the huge battles, so as the imperial preceptor of Southern Garden Nation, there were still countless matters that Zhong Qiu needed to attend to. His visit to Chen Ping'an today served two purposes. Firstly, he could avoid misunderstandings between the two of them. Secondly, he had his own personal interests, and he could use this visit as a chance to relax his mind and enjoy some fresh air. Thus, Zhong Qiu bade farewell and left after discussing the necessary matters. Before Zhong Qiu left, Chen Ping'an was slightly apologetic as he said, "I'm temporarily unable to leave the lotus flower-blessed land." Zhong Qiu smiled and replied, "That's okay. In any case, you don't seem like an otherworldly immortal at all, Chen Ping'an." After leaving the courtyard in the nameless alley, Zhong Qiu's expression was downcast as he walked along the deserted street alone. If the first otherworldly immortal that he and Eugenie had come across back then had been Chen Ping'an, then would the events of the past few days have taken a completely different trajectory. Qian Ping'an grabbed his small stool and entered the dark and gloomy alley. He suddenly squinted his eyes. An emaciated little girl was standing outside the courtyard. She subconsciously stepped back before looking up and carefully observing Qian Ping'an's expression. She had already thought up many excuses, yet surprisingly didn't dare to utter a single word at this moment. "Where are those books?" Qian Ping'an asked. The little girl blinked before shaking her head in earnest and replying, "I don't know." As if afraid that Qian Ping'an didn't believe her, she put on an aggrieved expression and explained, "The battle between you and those bad people was so violent, and that man and woman also walked out from this alley back then. How could I dare to return? I obediently sat on the small stool the entire time, but I couldn't see you anymore afterward, so I didn't wait for you to return and hurriedly ran away instead. I was afraid that those bad people would come back for me." Qian Ping'an waved his hand, signaling that she could leave. He didn't want to see this scheming little girl anymore. However, the skinny little girl appeared extremely pitiful as she continued, "I'm begging you, can you please let me stay for a meal before shooing me away?" Qian Ping'an ignored her, locking the gate after he entered the courtyard. Chao Qinglang had surprisingly prepared dinner for himself. The little boy was intelligent and dutiful, and even though he had never cooked before, he had seen his parents cook many times in the past. Now that he was forced to cook for himself, the dishes that he made naturally wouldn't be delicious. However, they would at least be edible. In fact, Chao Qinglang had cooked for himself for the past 2 days. Qian Ping'an never went over to help, and he would often choose to leave the courtyard whenever Chao Qinglang entered the kitchen. Today was no different. In the past, the little boy would have already finished eating and cleaned up the dining table when Qian Ping'an returned. He would then return to his room and stay there, and might occasionally come out at night only if he needed to cool down a little. However, today was different, and Chao Qinglang was eating very slowly as he sat at the dining table. Not only that, but an additional set of bowl and chopsticks were placed opposite him. Qian Ping'an quietly walked inside and sat down. He chewed slowly and didn't make a single sound. A thud traveled over from the courtyard. The skinny little girl stood up and patted the dust from her clothes before slowly tiptoeing over. However, she didn't dare to enter the dining room, and instead squatted there and craned her neck to stare at the table of food. Chao Qinglang thought for a moment, and eventually decided to walk to the kitchen to grab a bowl of rice for her. He handed her the bowl of rice and a pair of chopsticks and said, "Let's eat together." Qian Ping'an put his bowl and chopsticks down and looked at her. Tears brimmed in the little girl's eyes, and she also put her bowl of rice and chopsticks down on the table. She remained sitting there, unmoving. Chao Qinglang felt a little exasperated and he said, "It's okay, you can eat." However, the eyes of the skinny little girl remained fixed on Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an picked up his bowl and chopsticks, not wanting to look at the little girl anymore. Only then did she lower her head and start to eat. She occasionally grabbed some food from the dishes in the middle of the table, but would appear as furtive as a thief when she did so. The three of them finished eating at around the same time, and Chao Qinglang stood up to collect the bowls and dishes. The skinny little girl glanced at Qian Ping'an before standing up and pretending to help. The two children of around the same age each carried some bowls and dishes with them as they walked to the kitchen. The skinny little girl glanced back at the courtyard, and upon seeing that Qian Ping'an wasn't there anymore, she lowered her voice and complained, "There's no oil in the food, and it was also so salty. Do you actually know how to cook? You're already so old, so can you please get your act together?" Chao Qinglang was rendered speechless. Seeing that she wasn't going to relent, however, he could only reply, "Okay, I'll keep this in mind next time." Qian Ping'an suddenly appeared in front of the kitchen door, causing the skinny little girl to immediately shut up. She was just about to deny any wrongdoing and ignore Qian Ping'an, yet she saw him waving his hand with a stern expression and gesturing for her to go over. In the end, she had no option but to hang her head and walk out. Qian Ping'an grabbed her by the collar, holding her as if he were holding a little chick as he opened the courtyard door and placed her outside. Before shutting the door, he warned, "I'll throw you all the way outside the capital if you dare to climb the wall again." When night arrived, Qian Ping'an sat with his eyes closed as he rested his mind. Not long after walking into the courtyard to enjoy the cool breeze, Chao Qinglang heard the sound of coughing traveling over from outside the courtyard door. He walked over to open the door, only to see the skinny little girl squatting there with her head tilted upward and her arms crossed in front of her chest. There was a wide smile on her face as she said, "Don't mind me, it's even cooler out here in the alley." Chao Qinglang scratched his head in reply. He was truly afraid of this little girl. Chen Ping'an looked up and furrowed his brow. Under the soft glow of the moon, there was a saber-carrying man dressed in a black robe standing on a roof ridge in the distance. He possessed an elegant disposition, and held a pot of wine in one hand as he smiled faintly at Chen Ping'an. Since Chen Ping'an didn't say anything, he decided to tap his foot and gracefully glide toward the courtyard where the young boy was sitting. Seizing the opportunity when Chao Qinglang was still outside, Chen Ping'an immediately threw a punch, one that appeared completely smooth and natural. Tang Tie, the mighty dragon general from northern Jian Nation, was struck in the chest and directly sent flying backward by the silent burst of fist aura. He landed back on the same roof ridge in the distance. Chen Ping'an's fist aura was incredibly refined and perfectly weighted. Tang Tie was one of few top-notch superior grandmasters in this world, yet he was left extremely disheveled even though he wasn't wounded by Chen Ping'an's attack. However, not only was Tang Tie not embarrassed into rage, but he even gave an apologetic smile to Chen Ping'an, seemingly expressing guilt for disturbing the young boy and coming here without invitation. With refiner hanging by his waist, Tang Tie turned around and left just like that. Chen Ping'an didn't have strong impressions of this person, and he didn't want to become overly involved with him either. He thought for a moment before telling Chao Qinglang not to wait for him tonight. He then left the nameless alley and headed toward Champion Scholar Alley. There was no wine left in his sword-nurturing gourd, so this would be a good opportunity to refill it as well. It was already midnight, yet a quiet restaurant in Champion Scholar Alley was still brightly lit. There was only one table of customers. This could be considered a family dinner because even the chefs had been brought over by this table of customers. There were 3 men and 3 women. It wasn't just this restaurant, but the entire Champion Scholar Alley was heavily guarded as well. Apart from armored soldiers standing 3 paces apart, there were also many elites with concealed identities keeping watch in the surroundings. Unless it were a superior grandmaster from the list of upper 10 elites, it would essentially be impossible for anyone to charge over and assassinate one of the customers. In fact, they wouldn't even be able to get close. The 6 customers were Emperor Wei Liang of Southern Garden Nation, Empress Zhou Shuzhen, Crown Prince Wei Yan, the second prince, and the youngest princess. In addition to them, there was also Huang Ting, the Taoist nun from Peace and Tranquility Mountain, who had now changed into elegant Taoist robes. She had once been Mirror Heart Hall's Fan Wanner and Tong Qingqing. Princess Wei Zhan had inherited her parents' good looks, and was indeed a rare beauty in this world. However, she still felt very inferior in front of that Taoist nun. She was a lively and energetic person, yet barely dared to say anything tonight. Instead, she clung to her mother, Zhou Shuzhen, the entire time. Meanwhile, she felt immense admiration for the stunningly beautiful Taoist nun, who appeared even more confident and straightforward than Imperial Preceptor Zhong when speaking to her father. She had collected many prohibited books over the years, all obtained after her 2 older brothers were unable to withstand her pleading. She had gotten her hands on all kinds of mystical and historical novels from the markets and bookstores. What was the Cultivation world? In her dreams, the Cultivation world was somewhere where a gallant immortal couple would charge into the den of some chillingly evil person during a dark and windy night. When the first ray of light peeked over the horizon again, the evildoers and sinister people would all be dead as the man and woman exchanged a smile with each other. They would then leave on horseback, continuing their adventure through the Cultivation world. Emperor Wei Liang smiled and asked, "There's Eugenie outside my nation and there's Chen Ping'an inside, so is this truly not a problem?" Huang Ting's reply wasn't exactly polite and she explained, "In fact, it won't be a problem even if both of them are inside the capital. One is unusually determined in his pursuit of cultivating Tao, while one can't be bothered interacting with you guys at all. However, emperors like you are fond of the saying, 'How can one allow others to snore beside their bed?' 1. I can understand the discomfort that you feel. In any case, Eugenie has been an eyesore for me as well, so I might as well charge over and have a fight with him." Huang Ting's words became increasingly unrestrained and impudent as she continued, "I guarantee that I'll fight Eugenie with my full strength. If I lose and if the so-called elite army of Southern Garden Nation fails to stop Eugenie as well, allowing him to charge into the imperial palace and kill your entire family, then the most I can do is try my best to avenge you before I ascend from this world. Wei Liang shook his head with a wry smile, drinking wine to quash his worries. In reality, the person who felt the most awkward right now was actually Empress Zhou Shuzhen. Not only had her junior sister become her master, but she had even become Peace and Tranquility Mountain's Huang Ting. Meanwhile, the most disappointed person was most likely Crown Prince Wei Yan. The Fan Wanner whom he loved would never return again. Even though the Taoist nun in front of him was more breathtakingly beautiful than Fan Wanner, Wei Yan couldn't bring himself to like her no matter what. As for the person who felt the most uneasy, this was the second prince who looked almost exactly like his father. From Grand Leader Ding Ying to Yer and then to the elites who had concealed themselves in the capital, all remaining members of the demonic force had either been killed or captured and thrown into jail by the joint force of Imperial Preceptor Zhong, the celestial maidens from Mirror Heart Hall, and the guest elders of the imperial court. The three factions of the demonic force all had extremely close ties to the second prince. All of the delicacies seemed dull and tasteless to him right now. It was as if he were eating wax. He felt slightly envious of his little sister's naivety, and felt even more jealous of his older brother's divine fortune. Who could have imagined that the peerless old demon Ding would actually be killed? That stinky girl Yer had once patted her chest and said with confidence that her grandmaster might not be dead even when they died of old age. There was the sound of unusual commotion traveling over from outside the restaurant. Huang Ting smiled and said, "Our esteemed guest has arrived." Emperor Wei Liang immediately looked outside the window. He was extremely tense and anxious, and was feeling slightly regretful that he hadn't invited Imperial Preceptor Zhong Qiu. After all, Zhong Qiu had a fairly good relationship with that person. There was indeed some form of friendship between them. After sitting there and waiting for a long time, he discovered that the young otherworldly immortal was walking over from the stairs. He had surprisingly kept a low profile, entering the restaurant through the front door and walking to their table via the normal stairs. The young otherworldly immortal was none other than Chan Ping'an. He wasn't wearing that eye-catching white robe. Instead, he was dressed in the garment of ordinary, somewhat well-off commoners of Southern Garden Nation. Wei Liang composed himself before standing up. Even the emperor had stood up, so Zhou Shuzhen and her 3 children hurriedly stood up as well. Huang Ting didn't put on airs, but she was clearly less keen than the imperial family as she stood up. However, she didn't remain in the same spot, and she instead walked to the window, seemingly removing herself from the situation. She would leave the discussion and the decision-making to the ruler of this land and the passing otherworldly immortal. She wouldn't favor anyone. Wei Liang laughed heartily and said, "My Wei clan failed to welcome you properly, and we even allowed such a huge commotion to take place in the capital. Please forgive us, esteemed immortal Chan." Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied, "There's no need to worry about these things, Your Majesty. This commotion had little to do with Southern Garden Nation." Emperor Wei Liang was unable to fully understand Chan Ping'an's stance. He was afraid that he had missed some deeper meaning behind Chan Ping'an's words. However, Chan Ping'an had already opened his mouth again, saying, "Since Your Majesty has already come here, I thought that I would directly pay you a visit and say some things frankly. Southern Garden Nation can treat me as if I don't exist. Please rest assured, Your Majesty, if it weren't for Ding Ying and Eugenie actively seeking me out, I might have remained a spectator of the battle from the beginning to the end." Wei Liang smiled and nodded in understanding, replying, "Esteemed Immortal Chan is an immortal from the mountains, so you naturally won't be willing to involve yourself in the trifling conflicts of the mortal world." Chan Ping'an suddenly smiled as well, saying, "The scenery in the capital of Southern Garden Nation is quite nice. There's a local delicacy that's especially delicious, and I'll definitely eat it again before I leave the capital. Dare I ask, esteemed immortal, what place and what food are you speaking of?" Emperor Wei Liang asked in curiosity. "I can." He immediately cut himself off and raised his wine cup, downing its contents in a single gulp. "I broke the rules right after you laid them out. I need to punish myself by drinking this cup of wine." Chan Ping'an grabbed his wine gourd and said, "I might need to trouble Your Majesty with delivering me 2 pots of wine as well." Wei Liang laughed loudly and replied, esteemed immortal Chun. As an esteemed guest of my nation, you're a bit too easy to please, aren't you? The emperor was cracking a joke, so Empress Zhou Shuzhen, the two princes, and the young princess immediately started to laugh as well. Chun Ping'an only came to his senses slightly later, but immediately started to laugh as well, lest he appear too cold and indifferent. Even though Taoist Nun Huangting was standing in the distance and facing the window, the corners of her lips also curled up into a smile. Chun Ping'an filled his sword-nurturing gourd with wine before quickly taking his leave. However, he didn't return to the small alley right away, and instead relied on his memory to find that night market near White River Temple. He ate a large bowl of that mouth-numbingly spicy and piping hot food. If one didn't eat spicy food, if one didn't drink alcohol, and if one didn't eat the spiciest hot pot while drinking the strongest alcohol, then what joy would there be in life? This was what the old sword saint from Watercombing Nation had said to him. Chun Ping'an hadn't necessarily agreed with this remark before, but as he enjoyed food and wine in this bustling night market, he felt like the old senior's words genuinely rang true. After paying for his meal, Chun Ping'an stood up and left the noisy and lively night market, slowly walking along the deserted streets elsewhere. He jumped onto a roof ridge before making his way to the large residence of that official again. He entered the private scripture library, but was no longer looking for the history books and literary works that talked about the world. Rather, he was looking for books that discussed the construction of bridges. However, it was a pity that his search yielded no results. Since this was the case, he considered visiting the Ministry of Works to go through their scripture library and documents. After mulling over this for a while, he surmised that it would be better to inform Zhong Qiu about this if he found the chance. It most likely wouldn't be too difficult to ask the imperial preceptor for help. In addition, he also needed to ask Zhong Qiu about a certain impoverished scholar. Chun Ping'an walked out of the scripture library. In the end, he stopped atop the roof of a tall building, sitting down to drink wine. After drinking for a while, he raised his middle finger at the sky. There was no thunder and there was no lightning. Chun Ping'an put his wine gourd away and let his mind go adrift amid the refreshing night breeze. Between leaving the Flying Eagle Fortress ascending Sun platform and entering Southern Garden Nation, Chun Ping'an had visited a city of paper humans. The elderly abbot of Heart Manifestation Temple had once repeated the same remark many times. You look at it, and it's also looking at you. The young girl who had still been Fan Wanner at the time had shot two meaningful looks at him in the past, once in White River Temple and once in the night market. The expression in her eyes had seemed slightly familiar, yet she hadn't said anything. This likely wasn't because she didn't want to, but rather because she couldn't. Carefully ruminating over this, Chun Ping'an felt an increasing sense of lingering fear. He breathed a soft sigh. The lights in the world and the stars in the sky. Someone had once said that the latter might be the corpses of countless gods and deities. Who had said this again? Chun Ping'an smacked his head. He couldn't recall anymore. He hadn't drunk a lot tonight, but for some reason, he was much more inebriated than usual. Chun Ping'an leaned back and fell fast asleep. An old Taoist priest stood on the curved eaves and took a glance at the peacefully sleeping Chun Ping'an. The old Taoist priest pursed his lips as he recalled another scene from before. When quietly apologizing to the little boy in the small courtyard, the face of the young otherworldly immortal had actually been filled with tears. In your eyes, is there no small matter in this world? The old Taoist priest murmured to himself. A light snow coin was pinched between the old Taoist priest's fingers, and it gradually vanished bit by bit. He left the capital of Southern Garden Nation with a single stride, silently arriving at the ruins of Bull Mountain. Even Eugenie, who had constructed a thatched cottage and decided to cultivate here, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Right now, Eugenie was standing outside his simple thatched cottage, bathing in the moonlight with his hands clasped behind his back. He had already ordered the elites of Lake Mountain faction as well as his several direct disciples to return to the sect, and they were told to keep a low profile for the near term. The childlike leader of the righteous forces in the world was now wearing a silver-colored lotus flower hat. This was as per the agreement between them. After they succeeded, Ding Ying would give him this Taoist hat named Seeking Profound. This was the most mystical immortal treasure in the history of the lotus flower-blessed land. Not one of the most mystical, but the most mystical. Apart from possessing the ability to automatically protect its owner's physical body and soul, it was also able to temper one's body and calm one's mind. Most importantly, this Taoist hat could help one find the otherworldly immortals who were hidden in this world. Yu Zhenyi had roughly mastered the mystical ability to observe mountains and rivers through his palms already. When gazing at the capital of Southern Garden Nation from the distant peak of Bull Mountain back then, Dingying, Changping, Lu Feng, and a few others had appeared like the most dazzling and eye-catching specks of light in the world. Now that he had obtained this Taoist hat, his ability to find otherworldly immortals became even more comprehensive. As long as he managed to break free from the imminent encirclement, he was 90% confident that otherworldly immortals wouldn't be able to escape from his grasp in the future. They would find it extremely difficult to do anything. A colored glaze flying sword hovered beside Yu Zhenyi. Inside his sleeve was another valuable immortal tool that he had just obtained. However, the characters in the book were strange, and there was no mention of the four nations. Yu Zhenyi knew that the answers most likely rested with Reverence Pagoda or Mirror Heart Hall, the two forces who understood otherworldly immortals from beyond the heavens the most. Yu Zhenyi felt complete indifference toward Dingying's death. He naturally didn't feel any sadness. At most, he was simply irritated about Dingying falling at the final hurdle, forcing him to make many significant changes to his and Lake Mountain faction's numerous plans. Dingying was battling the heavens, while he was seeking to rule the mortal world. This was the tacit understanding that had developed between Dingying and Yu Zhenyi. Their great Tao complemented each other's, so the leader of the righteous forces and the leader of the demonic forces who should have been most likely to fight to the death with each other had instead chosen to form an alliance in secret, setting up the final battles in the capital of Southern Garden Nation. The difference between them was that Dingying wanted to kill everyone on the list of upper 10 elites minus the two of them, while Yu Zhenyi only targeted otherworldly immortals. In other words, Yu Zhenyi had only targeted Zhou Fei, Tong Qingqing, Feng Qingbai, and of course the most recent arrival Chan Ping'an. Yu Zhenyi started to take a walk under the moonlight, with each inhalation and exhalation being a form of cultivation. This was also the fundamental reason Yu Zhenyi had the incredible will and resolve to abandon his pinnacle martial arts cultivation in the past. The most important quality in cultivation was the strength of one's mind, and it was this lofty peak that Yu Zhenyi truly yearned to reach. The realm of martial arts was far too low and basic, and those brutes in the cultivation world were essentially rolling around in mud their entire lives without realizing their own crudeness. People like Chang Yuanshan were insatiably greedy, and they hoped to take possession of everything that they laid eyes on. People like Tang Tie coveted power and influence on the battlefield, and they dreamed of one day ruling over the world and possessing all beautiful women, thinking that it would be even better if they went down in history with a good reputation. However, such people didn't understand that all would be moot and impermanent if one didn't obtain longevity. Meanwhile, people like Lu Zong were extremely stubborn in their pursuit of a single goal, with Lu Zong seeking only to increase his raw strength. People weren't worth a mention. However, it was a pity about Zhong Qiu. They were once intimate friends, yet Zhong Qiu had now erected a barrier and imprisoned himself within. Yu Zhenyi walked in any direction that his mind led him, and his stride varied and lacked any consistency. His steps were sometimes the same as those of ordinary people, and they were sometimes more than 30 meters in length. However, he never walked too far in any certain direction. There were also times when he would leisurely stroll along a large and formless arc. This scene struck fear and apprehension into the hearts of those meritorious generals from Southern Garden Nation, who were guarding various checkpoints around Bull Mountain. They were terrified that they would suffer the great misfortune of Yu Zhenyi choosing to break free from their direction. The capital was extremely close enough to see with the naked eye if they turned around. This also meant that the emperor could see their each and every move. Thus, who dared to retreat and shirk responsibility if Yu Zhenyi decided to attack and attempt to break free tonight? No one thought that marshalling 10,000 or so elite troops from the capital to encircle a little child was strange or hilarious. After all, who had imagined that a battle between two grandmasters could annihilate the entire Bull Mountain? They were mortal humans who were versed in strategy and skilled in battle, and they could die in contentment if they were fighting against fellow mortals on the battlefield. However, to die from a single flick of an immortal's sleeve or a single snap of their fingers, perhaps they would die before they could even catch sight of their immortal opponent's appearance. Not only that, but swathes and swathes of them would die at a single time, leaving a mountain of corpses in the immortals' wake. What kind of fucking death was that? Eugenie naturally wouldn't care about the thoughts of these generals and soldiers from Southern Garden Nation. Right now there were only two people whom he truly cared about. Tong Qingqing was one of them, and she was still yet to become involved in the conflict even now. When standing on the city wall back then, even Eugenie had felt a slight sense of danger when Tong Qingqing had grabbed a sword from the shattered copper mirror. However, there was someone whom Eugenie feared even more. That was naturally Qian Pingan, the young otherworldly immortal who had ruthlessly killed old Demon Ding in a head-on battle. Eugenie wasn't afraid of the huge army encircling him. In fact, he wouldn't be afraid of fighting with Tong Qingqing either. However, he didn't dare to let his guard down against Qian Pingan. No matter how he racked his brain, Eugenie couldn't think of why Qian Pingan hadn't obstructed him from traveling here to absorb the abundant spiritual energy, thereby allowing his cultivation base to rise steadily. Perhaps he had suffered extremely grave wounds during his battle with Ding Ying? Perhaps he was nothing more than an empty shell of his former self right now? And it was because of this that Qian Pingan had purposely stopped before walking through the city gate and entering the capital? Rather than threatening them, he was actually acting mystical on purpose in order to trick all of the superior grandmasters on the city wall? Eugenie stopped and looked toward the capital, its outline glowing softly under the radiance of the moon. However, he ultimately decided against charging over to probe the situation. After all, things would genuinely become disastrous if Qian Pingan teamed up with Mirror Heart Hall, as well as Imperial Preceptor Zhong Qiu. At that time, with Tang Tie and Chang Yuanshan swaying loyalty, they would definitely choose the more powerful side and comprehensively side with Southern Garden Nation. Eugenie returned to his thatched cottage, reaching out with a hand and lightly running his palm over the colored glaze flying sword. He was able to fly on his sword with the demeanor of an immortal now, yet he was still far from becoming truly free and untroubled like those immortals in the books. He was unable to ascend to great heights, and unable to travel on the wind for great distances. This was truly a great shame. Eugenie's gaze shifted upward toward the bright moon. There would eventually come a day when he would soar through the air on his flying sword and travel above the head of the mortal world. He would peer down at the mountains and rivers, and only the sun, moon, and stars would be loftier than him. However, Eugenie suddenly lowered his gaze. A blurry figure was standing on the ruined city wall that was still undergoing repairs, yet in Eugenie's eyes, what appeared there was a radiant and detestable ball of light. "You've come already?" Eugenie asked with a cold chuckle. Atop the city wall was a young Taoist nun with a sword strapped to her back. She was sitting cross-legged on a merlin, and holding a ceramic pot still piping hot in one hand. An appetizing fragrance wafted through the air, and the chopsticks in her other hand moved like a blur as she enjoyed the delicious food and mumbled, "Good heavens, this dish is so incredibly delicious. However, it's just too bloody spicy. Ah geez, I can't buy 2 portions at once next time." Several soldiers on horseback exited the city gate beneath her, galloping toward the 10,000 soldiers in the distance to deliver a military command personally issued by the emperor. Of the Imperial Guard and the 3 armies stationed around the capital, only the large army responsible for guarding the northern city gate was ordered to remain and defend the gate to their last breath. The other armies were all ordered to leave their stations and retreat 10 kilometers. It was as if they were creating space for someone. Indeed, they were creating space for Eugenie, and the breathtakingly beautiful Taoist nun sitting on the city wall. Huang Ting was still slurping up the delicious food, and would only look up occasionally to glance toward the direction of the flattened Bull Mountain. If Eugenie decided to flee with all his might, she would be left with no option but to watch him vanish. She definitely couldn't catch up to him. After finishing her meal, Taoist nun Huang Ting from Peace and Tranquility Mountain placed the ceramic pot beside her, and lightly placed the pair of chopsticks on top of the pot. She stood up and patted her stomach, her face filled with regret as she grumbled, "I went over the top with this midnight snack. Now I'm going to gain another kilo. Sai, Fanwana, you sure were into rice bowls. Or maybe I should say rice buckets." She sat and waited until all 3 elite armies of Southern Garden Nation started to slowly retreat from their position. Huang Ting had an intense and unrestrained look in her eyes as she glared in Eugenie's direction. She wiped her mouth clean and said in a soft voice, "Well anyway, I'll probably lose this weight again after I finish this battle. Qian Ping'an, who was sound asleep on the roof ridge, was woken up with a start by the huge commotion coming from outside the capital. He gazed toward the south, only to see two bursts of spectacular sword light intertwining and clashing, causing brilliant rays of light to shoot through the air. There was Yu Zhenyi's colored glaze flying sword, and also Huang Ting's sword from the copper mirror. Qian Ping'an didn't return to his room to retrieve lasting qi, and instead retrieved a sword and a saber from 15th. The sword was Deep Infatuation, which had previously belonged to Dou Ziji, and the saber was Halting Snow, which had been passed down from generation to generation in the Flying Eagle Fortress. He fixed the two blades to his left and right hip respectively, then leaped forward, his figure appearing as nimble and elusive as clouds and mist. Zhongqiu was already standing atop the city wall, and it wasn't long before Qian Ping'an arrived beside the imperial preceptor of Southern Garden Nation. "They're fighting so soon?" Qian Ping'an asked. Zhongqiu nodded and replied, "Huang Ting is a cultivator from your world to begin with, so her grasp on spiritual energy is naturally far superior to ours. Does she think that she'll be unable to defeat Yu Zhenyi if she gives him more time to voraciously absorb the spiritual energy?" Qian Ping'an asked. "Of course not," Zhongqiu replied in exasperation. "If that were the case, then Huang Ting would have stepped forward to challenge him long ago. According to Huang Ting, she was purposely waiting for Yu Zhenyi to absorb as much spiritual energy as he could. Only then would she come here to challenge him. This way, Yu Zhenyi won't have any excuses when he loses to her. Take for example Qian Ping'an. When fighting with Ma Xian, the people woman and smiley face on the street, he had concealed his true strength time and time again while also feeling out the power level of this blessed land. He had then plotted against Bird's Eye View Peak's Lu Feng, and had finally fought and defeated Zhongqiu and Ding Ying in the end. Which step hadn't been calculated and careful? Which punch hadn't been measured and stable? Even though he couldn't understand Huang Ting's actions and thoughts, this didn't stop Qian Ping'an from feeling a slight sense of admiration and envy toward her. Traveling through the cultivation world, if one could reach such a lofty level where one no longer needed to care about life and death, then it seemingly made sense that one should be utterly fearless in the face of death. Qian Ping'an told Zhongqiu that he was looking for books related to constructing bridges. Hearing this, Zhongqiu smiled and said that he would help the young boy. In addition, there was also that matter relating to the people woman and the impoverished scholar with the surname Jiang. To the imperial preceptor of a nation, searching for a scholar staying in the capital and attending the imperial examination was a very simple and minor task. However, Zhongqiu didn't agree to help straight away and he asked, "Are you sure you want to see that scholar?" "I'll make that decision in the future," Qian Ping'an replied. Only then did Zhongqiu nod and agree to help. The two of them looked toward the ruins of Bull Mountain, where Yu Zhenyi and Huang Ting, two of the three most powerful superior grandmasters in the world, were engaged in an increasingly intense battle. Oftentimes, a single burst of murderous sword light would stretch for dozens or even more than 100 meters in length. Perhaps the safest place in the world at this moment was the city wall where Qian Ping'an and Zhongqiu were standing side by side. Thus, closely protected by the imperial guards, Empress Zhou Shuzhen, Crown Prince Wei Yan, Princess Wei Zhan, and a white-haired old general climbed onto the city wall and made a beeline for the two elites. Zhou Shuzhen naturally didn't dare to act high and mighty in front of Zhongqiu, so the two of them made some polite small talk with each other. Meanwhile, Wei Zhan couldn't help but tremble with fear when she saw the imperial preceptor. This couldn't be helped. Zhongqiu was one of her respected teachers, and also the one who had punished her with a cane for the first time in her life. Back then, the little girl's face was filled with tears and snot as she ran to her parents, whom she found playing Go with each other. To her dismay, one said that she deserved the caning, while the other said that she hadn't been caned hard enough. Afterward, Princess Wei Zhan feared Imperial Preceptor Zhong as if he were a vicious tiger. Since the old general could accompany the Empress and her two children, it could be presumed that he was a reputable old man with meritorious service. Sure enough, Zhongqiu addressed him by name. "Lu Xiao, why have you come here as well?" The old general was dressed in a suit of armor, and appeared full of energy as he humped coldly and replied, "More than half of the soldiers stationed outside the capital are good young men personally trained by me. What's wrong with retiring and returning home? I might not be able to fight on the battlefield anymore, I concede this, but I haven't lost my ability to deploy troops and appoint generals. So be it if you people stop me from leaving the capital, but are you even going to stop me from farewelling the soldiers now? The old man slammed his hand down on the city wall and said in frustration, "You grandmasters from the cultivation world are flying here and flying there all the time, so can you just stop and give it a rest for a while? One battle after the next, you people never stop fighting and never stop causing huge commotions. More than half of the residents in the capital can't even get a good night's sleep anymore. This is especially the case with that otherworldly immortal dressed in the white robe or whatnot. People have praised him to the high heavens, and they make him sound like such a mystical and profound person. What do they say? Even old Demon Ding was defeated by him, and he's an extraordinarily handsome young man to boot. In fact, even my grandson and granddaughter keep nagging me and asking me whether I'm acquainted with him. One wants to become the disciple of esteemed immortal Chun, and one wants to witness a true hero of the cultivation world. I'm acquainted with his bloody grandpa, I am. If I see that person in white robes, I'll definitely jab my finger in his face and scold him to death. To say nothing else, just his name alone is quite mediocre." Zhong Qiu forcefully suppressed his laughter. The old man raised his eyebrows in anger, and was just about to let loose a torrent of abuse. However, Zhong Qiu waved his hand and said, "That's enough. Her Majesty the Prince and the Princess are all here, so calm down and don't have your angry spittle fly everywhere, Lu Xiao." The old general shut up in dissatisfaction. Chun Ping'an didn't say anything, and he thought to himself that this old general was truly an honest and frank person. It was just that he was too short-tempered. Lu Xiao caught the young boy looking at him, so the angry old general glared back and interrogated, "What are you looking at, young boy? You dared to laugh at me?" Chun Ping'an didn't talk back to him, and simply grabbed his wine gourd and took a swig of wine. The old general mistakenly thought that Chun Ping'an was a member of the cultivation world, and was most likely an extraordinary young martial arts talent, especially since he was able to stand together with Zhong Qiu. At the same time, his character definitely wouldn't be bad. Thus, Lu Xiao was sincere and earnest as he said, "Young boy, just looking at you, it seems likely you have a slightly bookish aura. It's clear that you'll make an excellent student and scholar. I'm not trying to flaunt my age and seniority or anything, but I, Lu Xiao, am incredibly skilled at identifying talent. I sincerely encourage you to leave the cultivation world. I don't have extravagant hopes for you to provide meritorious service on the battlefields in the future, nor do I need you to loyally sacrifice yourself in battle. Instead, you simply need to learn from Imperial Preceptor Zhong. Of course, you only need to learn from his scholarly and noble side. After all, what's so good about being a dog's hit grandmaster or whatnot?" Chun Ping'an was rendered speechless. He could only force a smile and nod awkwardly before taking another swig of wine. Apart from being short-tempered, the old general was also quite blunt and harsh with his words. In reality, however, he was still a fairly kind-hearted person. Princess Weizhen secretly covered her mouth and giggled. She was well aware of Chun Ping'an's identity. Indeed, the two of them had already met once at the restaurant in Champion Scholar Alley. However, old General Lu only knew that the young person who had killed old Demon Ding was dressed in white robes, and was skilled in sword kinesis and immortal techniques. He clearly wasn't aware that the person whom he wanted to jab his finger at and scold him to death was standing right before him. As much as the old general detested the cultivation world, upon witnessing the brilliant rays of sword light flashing across the ruins of Bull Mountain, and the mighty bursts of chi soaring into the skies, even he couldn't help but secretly remark, "That's the power of true immortals." In any case, the stubborn old general didn't let slip any opportunity to lecture the young boy who had mistakenly gone down the wrong path. He turned to Chun Ping'an and persuaded, "Do you see that? That's the true power and demeanor of grandmasters. Just how many years will it take for you to reach such a level? Perhaps you won't succeed even if you're given 100 years, right? So I encourage you to abandon your pursuit of martial arts and turn to scholarly study instead. If you think things through one day and decide to abandon the brush for a military career instead, then that will naturally be even better. If I'm not 6 feet under at the time, then come and look for me, and I'll personally make recommendations for you. You can pick whichever elite army of Southern Garden Nation you want to join." Spittle flew through the air as the old general spoke with passion. Chun Ping'an wiped his face and sighed. In the end, He had no option but to introduce himself, saying, "My name is Chan Ping'an." The old general chuckled and replied, "So what if you're Chan Ping'an? It's not like your surname is Zhong or whatever. Which high-ranking official in Southern Garden Nation am I not familiar with?" However, the old general suddenly stopped speaking at this moment. He then put on a stern expression and nodded slowly, raising a thumb and playing dumb as he praised, "What a brilliant name!" Afterward, the old general acted as if nothing had happened at all. He silently walked over to stand beside Zhongqiu. He then silently shuffled elsewhere, eventually walking over to Crown Prince Wei Yan, who was standing the furthest away. At that moment, Lu Xiao decided that he would practice the virtue of silence for a while. Chan Ping'an observed the battle taking place at the ruins of Bull Mountain for a while longer before saying, "If you'll excuse me, I'll take my leave." No one objected or stopped him. Approximately 15 minutes later, Zhongqiu noticed some signs from the intense battle in the distance and remarked with a smile, "The battle was still 50-50 just then, but the momentum has already shifted now." Just like Crown Prince Wei Yan, Zhou Shuzhen was unable to fully understand the battle and determine who possessed the advantage. Old General Lu Xiao and Princess Wei Zhan naturally felt even more confused. Imperial Preceptor, he's going to leave just like that? Lu Xiao asked in bewilderment. Zhongqiu smiled and replied, "Given that Chan Ping'an was willing to appear on the city wall tonight, then Eugenie won't dare to act too wantonly." After saying this, Zhongqiu gazed toward the capital and sighed in his mind. "Didn't you say that you wouldn't care about these matters anymore?" The sky was still dark when Chan Ping'an silently returned to the courtyard in the small alley. The little lotus spirit had been curled up in Chan Ping'an's Dao robe, gold and sweet wine, for the past few days. It appeared increasingly calm and peaceful, so Chan Ping'an decided not to retrieve his Dao robe for the moment. After entering his room, Chan Ping'an discovered that the breathing of the little guy was becoming more and more stable. It had also shifted to a different sleeping posture, so Chan Ping'an helped to tuck in the corners of the Dao robe. Chan Ping'an walked out of his room and looked at the skinny little girl sitting on a small stool. She was leaning against the building door and sleeping, and from the visible frown on her face, she was probably dreaming of something not very pleasant. In fact, Chan Ping'an could vaguely tell from the little girl's sleeping posture that she was filled with vigilance and mistrust toward this world. Chan Ping'an clenched his hands into fists and gently rested them on his knees, quietly sitting there and waiting until the first light of dawn. The old Taoist priest suddenly appeared beside him without any warning. The old man was standing while the young boy was sitting. The old Taoist priest cut straight to the chase and said, "Since you're carrying Chan Qingdu's sword, lasting qi, I bent the rules and allowed you to enter the lotus flower-blessed land with your complete physical body and soul. As for why you came here, I know that as well. Simply helping you reconstruct your bridge of immortality isn't too difficult. However, there naturally doesn't exist such a simple and perfect solution in the world." The old Taoist priest pointed at Chao Qinglong's room before continuing, "I heard your conversation with that little boy, and your explanation regarding good and bad as well as sequential order allowed me to understand your relationship with that old scholar. After all, I was the first person in the world to learn of the old scholar's theory of sequential order, and he still has the face to mislead others with his mess of a theory." Upon saying this, the old Taoist priest chuckled coldly and revealed, "After learning of this, I decided to increase the level of difficulty a little bit, which is what led to you being encircled by those cultivators. It was also because of this that Ding Ying was able to trap that pocket treasure of yours. If you were too weak and ended up dying here, I wouldn't have made things too difficult for you either. I would have only kept you here for a few decades at most. Afterward, I would have let you leave exactly the same way that you came. You wouldn't need to worry about your physical body or soul. I might not get along with the old scholar, but I won't stoop as low as to take my anger out on you. However, some rules naturally can't be broken." "I see," Chan Ping'an said with a bitter smile. The old Taoist priest sniggered and continued, "Afterward, a mighty individual from the school of naturalists, an extremely mighty individual, mind you, interfered in a somewhat ambiguous manner. However, I tolerated his actions and didn't make a fuss because he stepped just above my bottom line. On the other hand, his disciple who has an innate yin and yang physique was far too flagrant. He possessed Fan Wanner twice and tried to warn you about the situation, as well as how to leave the lotus flower-blessed land. Because of this, I deactivated the remaining 2 immortal treasures in your possession. It was that paper human town and Northern Jian Nation. Chen Ping'an exclaimed. So you aren't completely stupid. The old Taoist priest chuckled. Both of these places were clues left behind by that person. It was quite interesting. As for why he was willing to interfere. Have you suffered at his hands before? Chen Ping'an's forehead was covered in beads of cold sweat. He felt a sense of fear that originated from the depths of his soul. Seemingly minor on the surface, matters that decided life and death would often arrive swiftly and decide one's fate in an instant. It was as if Chen Ping'an had been walking along a realm filled with white mist, unable to see anything clearly. A single misstep and he would have plummeted down a cliff. Not only that, but there would have been someone standing by the cliff and watching him fall with a cold gaze. Chen Ping'an only remembered him at this moment. He was that honest-looking man whom he had brushed past in the Flying Eagle Fortress. In fact, that man had even smiled at him. Moreover, he was the man who had sold Tonghulu in the small town when Chen Ping'an was still little. He was that kind and smiling man. Chen Ping'an had felt a slight sense of familiarity about him back in the Flying Eagle Fortress, yet he hadn't been able to recall anything no matter how he racked his brain. What Chen Ping'an remembered wasn't that person's appearance. Instead, what he remembered was that person's unique smile. From Jewel's Small World to Parasol Leaf Continent, Chen Ping'an wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. You finally remember who it is? Then do you understand the situation now? The old Taoist priest asked. Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, I understand now. He kindly warned me about the situation because he didn't want me to enter the lotus flower-blessed land, a place he has no control over. However, he's afraid of you, old senior, so he didn't dare to act too brazenly. You're a tiny bit better than stupid, the old Taoist priest said. However, you're only half correct. That person harbors no ill intent toward you. Otherwise, with your miserable luck, how could you have possibly found the little lotus spirit? I can resolve this situation so others can naturally resolve it as well. However, why have you only just learned of the truth? Don't you find this strange? The old Taoist priest asked. Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied without hesitation, I don't find this strange. I wouldn't have found it strange in the past either. However, that would have been a result of my naivety. In any case, linking this journey through the lotus flower-blessed land to the 2 long journeys that I completed in the past, I'm now able to understand many of my past encounters and interactions. As a result, I'm even less inclined to find this strange. You're fairly clever now, the old Taoist priest said with a nod. When can I leave the lotus flower-blessed land? Chen Ping'an asked. You should be asking when you can leave Southern Garden Nation, the old Taoist priest answered with a chuckle. He didn't leave Chen Ping'an hanging this time, and he immediately continued, I'll show you around this world when the matter in the capital of Southern Garden Nation comes to an end. Chen Ping'an grabbed his wine gourd and held it in midair, not drinking any wine. He couldn't suppress his curiosity anymore, so he mustered his courage and asked, Why? The old Taoist priest chuckled and replied, This old senior's Tao power is as lofty as the heavens. I obviously feel very bored. Chen Ping'an immediately used the tactic that he had just learned from old General Liu, acting stupid and playing dumb as if he hadn't heard the hint of ridicule in the old Taoist priest's words. After Chen Ping'an took another swig of wine, the old Taoist priest had already vanished from the small courtyard without a trace. The old Taoist priest was mysterious and elusive, and there was absolutely nothing that Chen Ping'an could do about this. Dawn arrived, and the skinny little girl sleeping against the door of the firewood shed had already woken up. The wealthy person in white was walking around the courtyard with his eyes closed, as if he was blind. One hand was open in front of his abdomen and facing the sky, while one hand was clenched into a fist and resting in front of his chest. His steps were extremely small and he was walking extremely slowly. It was as if he were debating whether he should slam his fist into his palm. The skinny little girl waited in boredom, and she always had the nagging feeling that he would eventually strike his palm. It would be great if this person were truly blind. If he slammed his fist down and accidentally destroyed his other hand with a crack, then that would be even better. The skinny little girl chuckled. However, afraid that the person in white would see through her thoughts, she immediately wiped the smile from her face and put on a stern expression. purposely yawning as well to conceal her chuckle. Chen Ping'an opened his eyes and exited the strange stance, one which he had learned from Ding Ying through the process of imitation. He was only assuming this stance because he felt like the lightning technique, which he had obtained from that blind old Taoist priest with 2 disciples after facing off against the female ghost in the wedding dress, required him to forcefully strike his acupoints with his fist. This was slightly similar to Ding Ying's situation. Chen Ping'an didn't look at the skinny little girl, nor did he stop walking forward. He continued to focus his fist intent on the mountain peak stance that Zhong Qiu had comprehended as he instructed. Go and check Chao Qinglong's private school to see if it's reopened yet. If the teacher is still absent, then ask the nearby neighbors when the school is going to reopen. You'll get breakfast after you return and after you refill the water vat in the kitchen, Chen Ping'an replied in a calm and indifferent voice. The skinny little girl gazed at the side of Chen Ping'an's face. He didn't seem to be joking, so she nodded in understanding and purposely stumbled as she stood up. She stuck close to the wall as she walked around Chen Ping'an and left the courtyard. After exiting the alley, she squatted near the intersection for a long time before sprinting back to the courtyard, causing beads of sweat to form on her forehead. She bent over and placed her hands on her hips, panting heavily as she said to that person who was still walking around the courtyard, "The school still hasn't reopened yet. I asked an auntie, and she told me that the teacher was scared out of his wits by that battle from a few days ago. Because of this, the school won't reopen anytime soon." Chen Ping'an remained silent as he pointed at the kitchen. A sullen expression appeared on the skinny little girl's face as she walked over and grabbed the smallest bucket. Fortunately, the water vat was still more than half full. If it were empty, it was guaranteed that she wouldn't be willing to fill it up. She would throw the bucket away and run off after leaving the courtyard. When she reached the courtyard door, she heard Chao Qinglang loudly reciting books. With her back facing the courtyard, she rolled her eyes and bared her teeth, an expression of utter disdain on her face. Fetching water was truly as exhausting as could be. When the skinny little girl returned to the courtyard with the small bucket, she once again stuck close to the wall and carefully made her way around Chen Ping'an. She then ran into the kitchen in a flash. She had only fetched enough water from the well to fill less than half of the small bucket, and she had even continued to pour water out along the way because she hadn't wanted to tire herself with carrying it all. Thus, there was only a mere inch of water left in the bottom of the small bucket when she finally returned to the courtyard. The skinny little girl furtively glanced around. She didn't see that person in white, so she immediately lifted the small bucket and quietly scooped up half a bucket of water from the water vat. She then lifted the small bucket with much effort before emptying its contents back into the water vat with a loud splash. Chen Ping'an silently observed all of this from a distance. However, he didn't expose her right away. She would rather rack her brain and think of ways to slack off than to spend a little more effort and get things done properly. After reciting several chapters from an elementary book, Chao Qinglang went over to the kitchen and started to cook breakfast. Chen Ping'an told Chao Qinglang that he would return very late tonight, to which the little boy nodded in acknowledgement. Chen Ping'an left the small alley with no name. When he passed Champion Scholar Alley, he saw that the courtyard where the demonic forces Ding Ying and Yi'er had stayed before was empty and lifeless. It was evidently abandoned. At the same time, the amount of incense being offered at Heart Manifestation Temple also dwindled by the day. However, the morning exercise routine taking place in that martial arts school was livelier than ever. The pupils shouted loudly as they trained, and the master teaching them fist techniques spoke even louder. The huge battle from a few days ago struck terror into the hearts of ordinary citizens. They felt like chaos was slowly creeping into their peaceful world. On the other hand, the huge battle inspired fascination and eagerness in the hearts of Cultivation disciples. After all, could the Cultivation world still be called the Cultivation world if there wasn't any howling wind or roaring waves? Chen Ping'an still wasn't wearing his Dao robe. Instead, he was now wearing a brand new azure robe. Firstly, the little lotus spirit was yet to fully recover, so it needed the help of the Dao robe, which acted much like a small blessed land. Secondly, Chen Ping'an didn't want to draw too much attention to himself. Thus, he even left his sword nurturing gourd in the room, instructing 1st and 15th to look after the recuperating lotus spirit. However, he was now carrying deep infatuation and halting snow by his hips, making him appear like a traveler who liked to wield all kinds of weapons. Right now, Qian Pingyan was heading over to visit Zhongqiu. He had one more request for the imperial preceptor of Southern Garden Nation. Even though the stack of books that the skinny little girl had stolen and sold were only ordinary books, Qian Pingyan had placed the 2 immortal books he purchased from Stalactite Mountain inside his pocket treasure. He wanted to get them back regardless. This was because he had recorded in neat compact script on the title pages of the books the location and time that he had purchased each book. Indeed, these books that Qian Pingyan had collected from all around the world held a special significance to him. This had nothing to do with the Confucian saying of books holding a house of gold and a beautiful wife within. 1. Everyone knew that Zhongqiu lived near the imperial palace. However, few people were aware of the exact location of his house. Fortunately, Qian Pingyan was just too famous in the capital of Southern Garden Nation right now. So much so that an elite recruited by the imperial court quickly appeared in front of him and respectfully led him to the residence of the imperial preceptor. This residence enjoyed a sense of peace and serenity inside the Virtue Worship District, an extremely busy area. The Virtue Worship District was genuinely a district that existed right under the emperor's nose, and the people who lived here were all officials or extremely wealthy individuals. There was lush greenery decorating the streets and alleys, and also an air of elegance and strictness mingling with the aura of peace and quiet. This was in stark contrast to the barking dogs and silvery laughter ringing through Champion Scholar Alley. There was no plaque hanging in front of Zhongqiu's residence, nor could it be considered a large residence by the Virtue Worship District standards. It only had 3 courtyards. Qian Pingyan thanked the elite who had led him here before walking into the residence by himself. After entering, he discovered that the residence wasn't quiet and empty at all. Instead, many young faces were busily attending to various tasks. They were all dressed in official garb. Yet judging by the embroidered picture on their clothes, they were all low-ranking officials who could just barely rank above petty officials. The rooms were filled with people, filled with young men walking around with official documents in their hands, most of them striding very briskly. Some were walking in pairs or groups, and these people would all be discussing important affairs. When they saw Qian Pingyan, who was carrying both a sword and a saber, they simply took 1 or 2 glances at him before turning their attention elsewhere. Zhongqiu was standing under the eaves of the main courtyard as he smiled and welcomed Qian Pingyan. A young official was standing beside Zhongqiu and reporting official matters to him, and the imperial preceptor offered a rough answer and provided some suggestions as well. Afterward, there was a succinct session of question and answer between the 2 of them. The young official was clearly a little interested in Qian Pingyan's identity, yet he didn't dare to overstep his authority and inquire about this since the imperial preceptor hadn't chosen to introduce his guest. The young official bade farewell and took his leave. Zhongqiu brought Qian Pingyan to the back courtyard, which was completely different from the lively and busy main courtyard. Only a single wall separated them. Yet it was as if Qian Pingyan had stepped into a different world. A big bunch of bananas rested in the corner, and they were so fresh and green that it seemed as if water were about to drip from them. An aged go board and 2 go boxes were sitting on the stone table, and most likely this courtyard was where the imperial preceptor lived. It wasn't shabby, yet it wasn't extravagant either. Instead, it was simple and elegant. Zhongqiu and Qian Pingyan sat opposite each other at the stone table. Zhongqiu told Qian Pingyan that he had already asked officials from the Ministry of Works to gather and organize books related to building bridges. In terms of information pertaining to the impoverished scholar with the surname Jiang, he could most likely provide something to Qian Pingyan tonight along with the requested books. Qian Pingyan felt a little embarrassed as he told Zhongqiu about the stolen books that had been sold for an extremely low price. Zhongqiu smiled and agreed to help Qian Pingyan locate the books. Qian Pingyan apologized for troubling Zhongqiu with so many trivial matters during such a difficult and tumultuous time for the capital, and offered to help with anything that the imperial preceptor needed. Zhongqiu didn't hold back either, and asked Qian Pingyan to help provide some guidance to his 2 direct disciples. He wasn't taking advantage of Qian Pingyan's help for personal benefit. Rather, what happened was that his 2 direct disciples would join the army after graduating from his tutelage. They would start as ordinary soldiers, and would stay in the army for at least 10 years. Afterward, they could continue to progress in the army if they desired, or they could also choose to leave and journey through the cultivation world. Zhongqiu wouldn't restrict them anymore. If they chose the latter option, however, They would be prohibited from announcing to the outside world that they were Zhongqiu's disciples. There was no room for discussion. If they broke this rule, Zhongqiu could naturally take back what he had given them. Both of Zhongqiu's direct disciples were fairly young. They were yet to graduate and were both incredibly talented and ambitious. Their characters were naturally fine as well. However, they had never truly experienced the cultivation world before, so it was necessary for someone to keep their vigor and confidence in check. Zhongqiu had been under quite a lot of pressure during the past few years, and had especially needed to remain vigilant against Ding Ying and Eugenie due to the conclusion of the previous period of 60 years. As a result, he had found it extremely difficult to focus any effort on teaching his disciples martial arts. Because of this, Zhongqiu was worried that his two disciples whom he had extremely high hopes for would ultimately end up as nothing more than just that, his disciples. Chen Ping'an was naturally happy to help. However, he didn't believe that he had the right to become a teacher and legitimately teach others. In any case, Chen Ping'an didn't expect that Zhongqiu would personally lead him to his two disciples. He couldn't help but ask, "Will this not delay your official duties?" Zhongqiu smiled and replied, "If my absence results in everything becoming a chaotic mess, then that will be a reflection of my failure to fulfill my duty as imperial preceptor of Southern Garden Nation for the past many years. It would mean that I failed to develop talent and only knew how to order others around." After saying this, Zhongqiu let Chen Ping'an out of the back courtyard through a small door. As they continued to walk, he suddenly asked, "How should prime ministers or imperial preceptors respond if they come across arguments or scuffles on the street?" Chen Ping'an pondered for a moment before replying, "They should step in and help if it doesn't detrimentally affect their primary duties." "And then?" Zhongqiu asked. Chen Ping'an shook his head in response. Zhongqiu chuckled and explained, "Just like you said, these lofty officials can indeed step in and help resolve these extremely trivial matters, as long as doing so doesn't lead to detrimental results for their primary duties. However, the most important thing is to immediately self-reflect. Why are there arguments and scuffles on the street in their jurisdiction?" Chen Ping'an ruminated over this for a moment before nodding in earnest agreement. Zhongqiu and Chen Ping'an walked along the quiet street that was kept cool by the shade of many trees. It was the middle of summer, and many districts in the capital were scorching hot like a steamer. It was so hot that there was nowhere to hide and seek reprieve. In this district, however, people could enjoy cool and refreshing shade as they walked along the streets. This was originally a story from a sagely book. In the story, the Prime Minister told the people beside him that he shouldn't interfere in the situation. He shouldn't overstep his authority, and he should instead hold to account the official responsible for the relevant jurisdiction. Zhongqiu said with emotion. "When I read this story for the first time during my youth, it was like a loud boom in my mind that allowed me to suddenly become enlightened. The more books I read and the more matters I experienced, however, the more I became puzzled and the more I was unable to answer the questions in my mind." Zhongqiu stopped and didn't continue. Chen Ping'an also remained silent. If Mr. Qi or the scholarly sage were present, they could definitely solve this difficult problem for Zhongqiu and clearly explain all of the underlying principles to him. Zhongqiu laughed and pushed these heavy matters out of his mind. He no longer appeared anxious as he said, "Eugenie has already returned to his sect in Cloud Pine Nation. He brought armed sage Cheng Yuanshan with him. Apart from Zhou Feiyer and Lu Zong who ascended back then, the rest of us who walked down the city wall all obtained some benefits. It appears that Eugenie obtained an imperial genealogy book, while Monk Yunny obtained a segment of white jade lotus root. The spies in the capital weren't able to figure out what Tang Tie obtained. As for me, I obtained a 5 Mountains picture album. It's a book about immortal matters, and it describes how one should assign the 5 mountains and gather the spiritual energy of their nation's mountains and rivers. However, I don't practice immortal techniques, so this book is completely meaningless to me." Zhongqiu sighed before continuing. Armed sage Cheng Yuanshan hid inside the capital the entire time, and it was because of this that he missed the final 2 drumbeats and wound up with nothing. His disciples have already been expelled from the nation as well. If he had waited a bit longer to flee, I would have dealt with him by now. After all, he's a person who will seek revenge for the smallest of grievances. He suffered such a huge loss in the capital of Southern Garden Nation this time, So he'll definitely encourage the horse riders of the grasslands to march south and plunder our cities. Not only that, but there was also another hidden danger regarding the Five Mountains picture album. Zhongqiu was surprisingly unable to destroy it, so he could only carefully hide it away instead. Eugenie would definitely covet this book once he learned of its existence. Eugenie was a person who cared little about the mortal world, yet the existence of the Five Mountains picture album might make him consider creating a puppet emperor and fighting to conquer the world for the first time in his life. Eugenie would do this for the sake of assigning the Five Mountains as the proper and righteous ruler of this world. Afterward, he could gather the spiritual energy of the Five Mountains for his personal use, and thus advance to become a genuine terrestrial immortal. Zhongqiu continued to tell Chen Ping'an about the great trend of the world, saying, Huang Ting, the Taoist nun who fought Eugenie to a draw, has transferred her position as sect leader of Mirror Heart Hall to Her Majesty the Empress. Huang Ting has left the capital and her whereabouts are unknown. She simply said that she was looking for a good place to earnestly practice her sword techniques. Meanwhile, Empress Zhou Shuzhen will pass away from sickness very soon. She'll head over to guard Mirror Heart Pavilion afterward, and even the Emperor won't be able to do anything about this. A rebellion has appeared in Reverence Pagoda recently, and the rebels have chosen to join forces with the remnants of the three demonic factions. Zhou Shuzhen has completely lost control of Reverence Pagoda already. In addition, Reverence Pagoda has also made an announcement to the Cultivation world, saying that they won't rank the upper 10 elites in the world anymore. As for Dragon General Tang Tie from Northern Jin Nation, he's still hesitant about whether he should defect to Southern Garden Nation. Chen Ping'an listened to this very carefully. Zhongqiu sighed with emotion and said, How good it would have been if you were the one to stand in that position instead of Ding Ying, someone who was hellbent on challenging the heavenly Tao. Chen Ping'an was puzzled by this remark. Don't worry about it. I was praising you in any case, so you don't need to dwell on it too much. Zhongqiu chuckled. Chen Ping'an also started to chuckle. He wasn't chuckling in a polite and perfunctory manner as he had with Emperor Wei Liang in the restaurant that night. Rather, interacting with Zhongqiu was like entering a room full of irises and orchids. 2. Zhongqiu's two disciples lived 3 districts away from the Virtue Worship District. Their residence was very large, and also outwardly advertised as a martial arts school that wasn't open to outsiders. Zhongqiu's first disciple was the one who had provided funds to set this up. This person had fought on horseback for 20 years and even became a general during this time. However, he had eventually retired from the army after suffering severe wounds on the battlefield. Zhongqiu's first disciple never dared to bother his master when he entered the capital, and the two of them would often meet in this large residence instead. Zhongqiu had disciples of all ages, with the eldest disciple already nearing 50 years old. Meanwhile, the 2 youngest disciples were a young boy and a young girl only 15 or 16 years old. However, Zhongqiu couldn't help but chuckle when he arrived at the martial arts training ground with Chen Ping'an. Including his 2 direct disciples, there were a dozen or so people having a lively discussion over there. There was old General Lu's grandson and granddaughter, and also the good friends that his 2 disciples had made in the capital. These were children from wealthy families who were mellow and dreamed of entering the cultivation world. In fact, several of them had already promised each other that they would travel through the cultivation world together with Zhongqiu's 2 disciples in the future. They would use the excuse of traveling around to seek knowledge. Zhongqiu didn't interfere with these kinds of matters. These were the beautiful dreams of youth, so even if they appeared childish, one shouldn't insist on using their experience as an elder to discourage them. Such dreams should not be quashed casually. Looking at these children, Zhongqiu would sometimes become frustrated and angry at their mischievousness as well. More of the time, however, he would find them lively and adorable. During such times he would feel as if this weren't the lotus flower-blessed land, and otherworldly immortals didn't exist. Chen Ping'an was slightly surprised to discover a familiar face among the group of youths. It was none other than the young girl whom he had come across while wandering around the capital in the past. She had been rushing through the streets on horseback with her companions, and had tossed a bag of coins toward an elderly female shopkeeper in order to pay for the mistakes of her friend. In the end, she had viciously crashed to the ground when trying to show off her riding skills. She had ached and groaned when jumping back onto her horse drenched in mud, yet had still raised her head high in a confident and high-spirited manner. At the time, Qian Ping'an had raised his thumb at her in praise. However, the young girl had completely ignored him, and had even rolled her eyes. None of the children recognized Qian Ping'an. After all, he wasn't wearing his white robe, nor was he carrying his vermilion wine gourd. Even though they didn't recognize Qian Ping'an, these youths all respected and feared Zhongqiu, so they immediately fell silent when the imperial preceptor appeared. Zhongqiu's two direct disciples felt slightly guilty as well, especially since they had indeed been slacking off on their martial arts training for the past few days. However, they didn't have a choice. Their friends had rushed over with no regard for anything else, and their eyes had been sparkling with delight as they had recounted the incredible feats of that sword immortal in white. It was said that the young grandmaster who had killed old Demon Ding had an extremely good relationship with the imperial preceptor, so perhaps they could truly meet him in person if they hung around in this place. This was especially the case with old General Lu's grandson and granddaughter. They were filled with excitement as they recounted how their grandfather was glowing with health and happiness when he returned home that night. During the intense battle outside the capital between Eugenie and Mirror Heart Hall's Tong Qingqing, the sword immortal called Qian Ping'an had stood right next to their grandfather. The two of them had expressed earnest regret at not meeting earlier, and they had enjoyed wine while conversing in absolute delight. It wasn't long before the two of them had become extremely good friends despite their significant age difference. However, it was a shame that Sword Immortal Qian was an extremely busy, powerful immortal. Even so, he had agreed that he would definitely pay a visit to the old general's residence whenever he found the time. Lu Zhao's grandson was only 12 or 13 years old, and would insist on repeating this story almost every single day. His face would be filled with excitement and emotion, and he clearly felt a shared sense of honor with his grandfather. However, his older sister didn't bang on about the same thing again and again. Even so, eager anticipation and admiration could be seen on her face. Zhongqiu turned around to look at Qian Ping'an, to which the young boy responded with a nod. Standing on the martial arts training ground, Zhongqiu looked at his two direct disciples and said, "I help the two of you invite this senior over. He'll offer you some guidance regarding fist techniques, so the two of you can feel free to attack with your full strength." Qian Ping'an felt slightly helpless and he lowered his voice and asked, "Didn't we agree just then that I would only spar with them? I never agreed to guide them." A tall and sturdy young boy strode over asking, "Master, who is this senior? He's carrying both a saber and a sword, so why is he going to teach us fist techniques instead? Perhaps his fist techniques are even loftier than Master's." The handsome young boy then looked at Qian Ping'an, his eyes limpid as he smiled and remarked, "Senior, it's not that I'm looking down on you, but my master's fist techniques are truly too profound. However, I naturally won't say anything if you teach us the saber or the sword." "Oh, that's right, my name is Yan Shijing. I'm a straightforward person, so please don't take any offense, senior." A young girl slowly walked over from behind him, and she was already observing Qian Ping'an and searching for his weaknesses. However, she walked slower and slower, because she was shocked to discover no weakness at all. He was casually standing there just like that. Yet she couldn't find a single weakness in his standing meditation fist stance. This extremely stifling feeling was far too similar to what she felt from her master, Zhongqiu. It was like coming across a towering mountain but not seeing the mountain peak, standing in front of a river but not seeing its bottomless depth. This young person dressed in azure robes was definitely a lofty martial arts grandmaster. The young girl was just about to remind her senior brother, Yan Shijing, to be careful, but the latter had already said in a soft voice, "I've already noticed. I'm not an idiot. And just how many people have the right to walk side by side with Master in Southern Garden Nation? Let's team up," the young girl suggested. The young boy didn't hesitate as he replied in a solemn voice, "Let's do our best to endure 10 exchanges. Master is watching us." The young boy and the young girl assumed a fist stance in unison, preparing to face off against Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an thought for a moment before starting to walk forward, using only the 6-step walking meditation and Zhongqiu's mountain peak fist stance. The two youths charged forward, and Qian Ping'an also strode forward at the same time, appearing like a lofty mountain peak weighing down on the shoulders of Yan Shijing and the young girl. They were frozen to the spot, as if a single move would lead to their deaths. Qian Ping'an took another step, and the bodies and minds of the two youths were already as tense as could be. The handsome young boy gritted his teeth and continued to advance, while the young girl tried to step aside to avoid Chen Ping'an's overwhelming intensity. She would get herself together and think of a new strategy after that. After Chen Ping'an took his third casual step, the auras of the senior brother and the junior sister had already collapsed once and for all. Chen Ping'an took a fourth step, and the two youths were already stumbling back with their bodies drenched in sweat and their faces as white as a sheet. Chen Ping'an stopped and asked, "You're clearly aware that throwing a punch and attacking me won't lead to death, so why did both of you refuse to throw a punch? If there comes a day when you need to battle to the death with someone, and death is inevitable, will you not dare to throw a punch as well? In that case, will you only dare to throw punches against opponents who are equal or weaker than you?" Yan Shijing collapsed into a sitting position on the ground. Meanwhile, the young girl angrily responded, "Senior, you're a top-notch martial artist, yet you're using your formidable aura to suppress us right from the very beginning. Who in the world spars? Teaching fist techniques?" Chen Ping'an repeated his question again, asking, "Why did both of you refuse to throw a punch?" Yan Shijing lowered his head. The rims of the young girl's eyes became bright red, and she surprisingly started to cry. However, she tried her best to glare at that stranger who liked to bully other people. Chen Ping'an realized that he had perhaps taken things a little too far, so he turned to face Zhongqiu and said in an apologetic voice, "I seldom spar with others, and I'm not too familiar with the rules of the cultivation world either." Zhongqiu shook his head, a look of contemplation on his face as he replied in a quiet voice, "I'm afraid of my disciples committing mistakes, so when I teach them fist techniques, I always overstress the principle of not using their fists too rashly. My intention is so that they won't act rashly, and based on just emotion when encountering issues in the cultivation world. This will also prevent them from picking on the weak and failing to control their strength. In addition to this, I also have further hopes that they can serve in the military and repay their nation for at least 10 years in the future. As a result, I've actually suppressed the natural ambitions of my disciples this entire time. Looking back at this, it can't be said that I'm completely wrong. However, I have indeed strangled and killed off their opportunity to surpass their master." Zhongqiu sighed before smiling at Chen Ping'an and saying, "I do indeed need to change." Unexpectedly, however, Yan Shijing was unable to endure his respected master admitting fault to others, despite being able to endure humiliation from an outsider. Moreover, the imperial preceptor was making this concession because of them. In Yan Shijing's mind, Master Zhongqiu was a genuinely flawless martial arts grandmaster. Not only that, but he was also a scholarly sage. In a fit of rage, Yan Shijing suddenly bounced back to his feet. However, the young boy didn't launch a sneak attack on Chen Ping'an, and instead glared at him and challenged, "Come at me again." Chen Ping'an strode forward, no longer adopting the seemingly slow fist stance in six-step walking meditation. Rather, his fist was like surging wind and rumbling thunder as it smashed toward Yan Shijing's forehead. The young boy retreated again. "Where's your punch?" Chen Ping'an asked. Yan Shijing was dazed and at a complete loss, an expression of utter dejection on his face. Chen Ping'an sighed and turned to Zhongqiu, saying, "Someone once told me that practicing fist techniques appears like physical cultivation on the surface, something that's for pure martial artists. However, cultivating the mind is also very important. Since they're practicing fist techniques already, they can no longer adhere to strictly mortal rules and emotions." "Mr. Zhong, you mentioned the principle of not using one's fists too rashly just then. I thought about this and it indeed makes a lot of sense. However, this is a principle that people with lofty cultivation bases such as yourself should adhere to. On the other hand, your disciples simply need to understand this principle instead of strictly adhering to it. Understanding this principle is one matter, but what choice they should make in a given scenario is a different matter altogether. Only in this way can they maintain a clear conscience when unleashing their fists at others in the future." Zhongqiu nodded and concurred with a smile. "That's exactly right." He roughly understood Chen Ping'an's temperament. The young man was someone who pursued perfection no matter how big or small the task. Thus, even though Chen Ping'an had been nervous before meeting Zhongqiu's disciples, not understanding how he would spar with them or teach them fist techniques, he had immediately become serious after taking that first step. In fact, he was no less serious than that time he had faced several enemies on the street. Zhong Qiu was a bystander, so he could clearly see and understand this. Meanwhile, perhaps even Qian Ping'an himself didn't know just how confident he had appeared just then. Indeed, he had even possessed a sense of domineering haughtiness, as if he were saying, "When I unleash my fists, the other martial artists in the world simply need to gaze up and exclaim their admiration toward my divine might." Zhong Qiu was actually feeling quite curious at this moment. Qian Ping'an was such an easygoing person, so how could he enter this kind of mental state when unleashing fist strikes? He became even more curious about how Qian Ping'an practiced his fist techniques. In any case, Zhong Qiu afforded respect to both of these Qian Ping'an felt slightly embarrassed as he admitted, "These are just some of my random thoughts. They might not be suitable for Mr. Zhong's disciples." Zhong Qiu shook his head and said with a serious expression, "There are some principles that are universal and ever correct. What you said just now is suitable for all martial artists." Qian Ping'an was afraid that Yan Shijing and the young girl's ambition to cultivate martial arts would shatter like a mirror after today's experience. So even though he wasn't especially good at comforting others, he still carefully chose his words and consoled. Apart from being able to endure hardships, those who practice fist techniques also need to possess a calm mind. Only then can one unleash swift and leisurely punches that surge forward with indomitable might. Once you achieve this, you can unleash extremely swift punches regardless of whether you're facing me, the most powerful martial artist in the world like your master, or a seemingly invincible opponent like Ding Ying. Qian Ping'an looked at Yan Shijing and the young girl solemnly and said, "To have no one in front, it's as simple as unleashing your fists." The youths were muddled and confused, yet the grief and indignation on their faces had already subsided significantly, as had the terror in the depths of their hearts. Zhong Qiu nodded softly. Was Qian Ping'an still teaching them fist techniques? He was clearly pointing them toward a certain martial Tao. In terms of how far these two silly children could walk in the future, and whether they could set foot on this path of martial Tao, this was dependent on both their talent and their fated opportunities. There was nothing more Zhong Qiu could add. In any case, saying anything extra would have no benefit at all. After lowering his fists, Qian Ping'an no longer possessed that formidable and domineering aura. He felt slightly uneasy as he looked at the pitiable young boy and the crying young girl, and he asked Zhong Qiu, "Was that too vague and abstract?" "Close enough is good enough," Zhong Qiu replied in a teasing manner. "Just how many words of praise do you want to hear from me today until you're happy?" Qian Ping'an didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Zhong Qiu looked at his two direct disciples and commented, "You don't need to practice fist techniques today. Think about why you didn't dare to throw a punch just then. It won't be too late to start practicing fist techniques again after you've thought this through." His other disciples naturally didn't receive this kind of special attention. The young boy and the young girl cupped their fists and accepted their master's instructions. Zhong Qiu and Qian Ping'an then left together. After the imperial preceptor and the strange young person in azure robes disappeared from sight, the group of young children quickly gathered together and started to chatter, with most of them consoling Yan Shijing and the young girl. At the same time, they also expressed their surprise and astonishment. Even though they knew that Imperial Preceptor Zhong was the strongest fist martial artist in the world, none of them had even witnessed Zhong Qiu fight directly. Meanwhile, the powerful elites guarding their clans' residences were all extremely haughty people. Thus, even though they had only witnessed a single punch from that person today, they still felt like their trip here was extremely worth it. Yan Shijing was the first to walk away from his group of friends. The young boy was in relatively low spirits, and appeared slightly adrift as he squatted on the stairs. After chatting with her friends for a while, the young girl sat beside her senior brother and expressed her displeasure at the injustice that he had suffered, exclaiming, "What was so impressive about him? At the end of the day, he simply relied on his loftier power to wag his finger at us. How infuriating! And he even did that in front of Master." Yan Shijing gazed into the distance and replied, "I feel like his words were quite reasonable. Master approved of them as well. I refuse to believe that he'll dare to utter such big words if he were to face off against Master, Eugenie or old Demon Ding." The young girl fumed. "As simple as unleashing one's fists? What a simple way to put it." Yan Shijing clenched his fists and vowed, "I won't slack off again after today. I'll earnestly hone my fist techniques, and I'll ask Master to teach me more profound fist techniques every single day. There'll eventually come a day when I force that person to take back the words that he spoke today. A bright glimmer appeared in the young girl's eyes as she gazed at the side of her senior brother's face and encouraged, "You can definitely do it. Even first senior brother has said that among all of the disciples, your talent is the closest to Master's. If you were given 5 more years to practice your fist techniques, you could have even rivaled Mirror Heart Hall's Fan Wanner, Springtide Palace's Zhou Shi, and the others." On top of the roof ridge, Zhong Qiu and Chan Ping'an were secretly sitting there and listening to the conversations of the youths. Zhong Qiu was also unsure of the reason, but Chan Ping'an had surprisingly suggested that they secretly make their way back. And thus, they were now sitting here and listening to the nonsensical conversations of the children. However, even after hearing the conversation between Yan Shijing and the young girl in the end, Zhong Qiu was still unable to guess Chan Ping'an's true reason for coming back. Even so, the Imperial Preceptor was slightly disappointed by what he heard. However, he didn't feel overly disappointed in those 2 children. Chan Ping'an smiled and stood up, genuinely leaving with Zhong Qiu this time. While returning, Chan Ping'an asked Zhong Qiu many questions about the martial arts and fist technique theories of this world, learning many things in the process. The 2 of them eventually parted ways, with Chan Ping'an picking a wine shop on the side of the street and ordering a pot of wine as well as 2 small snacks. He ordered the most expensive wine in the shop. The old Taoist priest suddenly materialized out of thin air, sitting directly opposite Chan Ping'an. No one in the busy wine shop noticed anything amiss. A wine bowl appeared in front of the old Taoist priest, and wine automatically flowed out from the wine pot and entered this bowl. When the old Taoist priest reached out, a pair of chopsticks had already appeared in his hand as well. He grabbed a piece of fried egg with spring onions and enjoyed it with relish. After a moment he smiled and asked, "Did you only just realize how laughable many of your innate and seemingly reasonable beliefs were? You always believed that you were an ordinary person, and were convinced that most people could emulate your feats and reach the same height as you as long as they were willing to put in the effort. Isn't that correct? Are you finally realizing just how laughable this is? Old senior, you have this much spare time?" Chan Ping'an asked. The old Taoist priest also sidestepped the question like Chan Ping'an, replying, "Your beliefs were a manner of severely underestimating those who taught you principles and fist techniques. If you had continued down that original path with those beliefs in such a mental state, then there would have eventually come a day when you became like that person. You would stand alone and look around in puzzlement. Not only that, but you would also be unwilling to ask others for help, afraid that you would detrimentally affect them. Haha, you would most likely obtain the title of honorable death as well." Chan Ping'an nodded and said, "If I hadn't made the correct choices and performed well enough, then I wouldn't be sitting here and leisurely drinking wine with old senior. Instead, I would have died a confused death in this place. Even if I were fortunate enough to regain my memories in my next life, I would have still felt an intense desire to fight to the death with old senior when I eventually left the lotus flower-blessed land, regardless of what the outside world became like." The old Taoist priest enjoyed the wine and snacks as he casually replied, "This is only natural. Since you chose to enter the lotus flower-blessed land, then it would be your own fault if your abilities were lacking and ultimately caused you to die at the hands of Lu Feng or Ding Ying. I would only pinch my nose and let you out of this world if Chen Qingdu and the old scholar teamed up to put pressure on me. Otherwise, you would obediently reincarnate in this world. Thus, you should raise a glass to yourself and thank yourself for being able to survive." In Chan Ping'an's mind, this old Taoist priest was no better than that man who had sold Tonghulus in the small town. This wasn't to say that the old Taoist priest was purposely targeting Chan Ping'an. In reality, Chan Ping'an knew that he didn't even have the right to be targeted. It wasn't the case that some of the old Taoist priest's principles and reasoning were incorrect either. Instead, Chan Ping'an simply disliked this kind of feeling. The way that these people looked at them wasn't like those cultivators in the mountains viewing others as mere ants. Rather, it was as if these people were treating them like livestock that could be slaughtered and eaten once they became fat enough. Or perhaps they could keep raising them and fattening them up. This was completely up to their whims. However, maybe this impression was due to Chan Ping'an not standing in a high enough position right now. As such, he was completely unable to see the scenery of the mortal world from their lofty perspectives. Chan Ping'an drank a bowl of wine. To say nothing of whether the cultivation world was good or not, the wine in the lotus flower-blessed land was truly very mediocre. Jian Lai continued to slowly drink, completely ignoring the old Taoist priest. He carefully thought about his journey and how he had ended up where he was today. He thought about his journey all the way from Clay Vase Alley to that alley with no name outside Chao Qinglong's courtyard. As it turned out, there were countless forks in the road along each person's path in the world. He needed to be kind to himself. Only then could he be kind to the world. However, this was very difficult. The worries in his mind could be washed away with wine. Yet, there were so many injustices in the world, so what could he do about those? His fist techniques would become loftier in the future, and his sword strikes would also become quicker. As he became increasingly powerful, did that then imply that he would have to step forward and deal with all of the injustices that he encountered? If he didn't do this, however, then how would he overcome that hurdle in his heart? Wouldn't that also be an injustice? Would he betray Mr. Qi's expectations? Would he betray those principles and reasons in the books? Would he betray his status as Li Baoping's junior uncle? However, he also needed to exact revenge, and needed to uphold his promise to Big Sister Immortal, the sword spirit of that rusty blade. At the same time, he needed to practice fist techniques to reach the 7th tier of martial arts. He needed to practice sword techniques and become a great sword immortal after he repaired his bridge of immortality. He needed to study to become someone like Mr. Qi, and he needed to marry that amazing girl. He would push all of these thoughts out of his mind and become drunk first. Jian Lai's head loudly crashed into the table. As he slept, it was as if someone asked him about his feelings after he had witnessed the largest river in his life. Still inebriated, Jian Lai laughed loudly and replied that with so much water, the fish would definitely be very large as well. In the past, little Baoping and the others had always complained about his fish soup being too bland. That being the case, he would definitely catch a big fish and add enough salt next time. The old man grimaced upon hearing this. He no longer used his Dao power to draw wine from the pot, and instead grabbed the pot with his hand and poured a bowl of wine for himself. He then asked, "Then what about your feelings after you witnessed the lofty mountains?" Jian Lai slapped the table, with his mind still fuzzy and his words still slurred as he murmured, "I don't know. However, there's a line from the books that reads, 'Charming the green mountains appear in my eyes.' I've already traversed so many mountains, and I feel like they're so difficult to navigate when it rains or snows. They're far too difficult to navigate." The old Taoist priest lowered his bowl and looked at the young boy sleeping opposite him, snapping, "How did Qi Jingchun end up with such a drunkard of a student?"